Part 1. The World as Will and Representation. Schopenhauer's entire philosophical system rests on one revolutionary insight that he considered his greatest discovery. He believed that reality has two fundamental aspects that we can understand, and that recognizing this distinction holds the key to comprehending everything about existence, suffering, and liberation. This insight became the foundation for his masterwork titled The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818 when he was just 30 years old. Though initially ignored by the academic world, this book would eventually be recognized as one of the most important philosophical works ever written. The first aspect of reality is what Schopenhauer called the world as representation. This includes everything we experience through our senses and everything we think about with our minds. When you look at a tree, you see something green with branches and leaves existing in a particular location at a particular time. When you hear music, you experience sounds that have rhythm, melody and harmony unfolding through time. When you think about mathematical concepts or remember past events, you are working with mental representations of ideas and experiences. All of this belongs to the world as representation. But Schopenhauer made a crucial observation about this world of representation. Everything we experience in this way is structured by certain fundamental organizing principles that our minds impose on experience. These principles are space, time, and causation. We never experience anything that is not located somewhere in space and somewhere in time. We never encounter an event that does not have a cause or that does not itself cause other events. These organizing principles shape everything we can possibly know or experience in the world of representation. Schopenhauer learned about these organizing principles from his philosophical predecessor Immanuel Kant. Kant had argued that space, time, and causation are not features of reality itself, but rather forms that our minds use to organize the raw material of experience. According to Kant, we can never know what reality is like apart from these mental forms. Kant called the world as it appears to us through these forms the phenomenal world, and he called the world as it exists independently of our minds the noumenal world, or the thing in itself. Schopenhauer accepted Kant's insight about the phenomenal world, but claimed to have solved the mystery of the thing in itself. While we cannot know the thing in itself through external perception or rational thinking, we do have one unique and privileged access to reality as it exists independently of space, time, and causation. This access comes through our immediate inner awareness of our own willing. When you feel hungry, angry, sexually aroused, or afraid, you are not experiencing representations of these states. Instead, you are directly experiencing the thing in itself as it manifests in your own being. This direct experience of reality Schopenhauer called the will. The will, according to Schopenhauer, is not the conscious decision-making process that we ordinarily call willing. Instead, it is the deeper unconscious force that drives all conscious willing as well as all unconscious processes in your body and mind. Your heartbeat, your digestion, your immune system, your instinctive reactions to danger, your sexual impulses, your need for food and shelter, your desire for companionship and status, all of these arise from the will. The will is the inner essence of your being, the thing you most fundamentally are beneath all the representations you have of yourself. But Schopenhauer's insight went far beyond individual human psychology. He argued that the same will that you experience directly in yourself is also the inner essence of everything else that exists. The force that drives a plant to grow toward sunlight is the same will that drives your hunger for food. The instinct that leads a bird to build a nest is the same will that drives your desire to create a comfortable home. The gravitational attraction between celestial bodies is the same will that drives your attraction to other people. At the deepest level, everything that exists is one unified will manifesting itself in countless different forms. This means that the apparent multiplicity and diversity of the world is ultimately an illusion created by the organizing forms of space, time, and causation. When we see many different individual objects and beings, we are seeing the one will refracted through the prism of representation. It is like seeing one white light broken into many different colors by passing through a crystal. The colors appear distinct and separate, but they are all manifestations of the same underlying light. Similarly, all individual beings and objects are manifestations of the same underlying will, appearing separate only because of the way our minds organize experience. Schopenhauer described different levels at which the will objectifies itself in the world of representation. At the lowest level, the will appears as the fundamental forces of physics: gravity, magnetism, chemical attraction, and repulsion. At the next level up, it appears as biological processes: growth, nutrition, reproduction. At a higher level, it manifests as animal instincts and behaviors: the drive to seek food, avoid danger, find mates, care for offspring. At the highest level of objectification, the will appears as human consciousness, with its capacity for abstract thought, artistic creation, moral insight, and philosophical understanding. Each level builds upon and includes the lower levels, so human beings contain within themselves all the earlier manifestations of the will. The will itself, according to Schopenhauer, has several essential characteristics that distinguish it sharply from the world of representation. First, the will exists outside of space and time. While individual manifestations of the will appear at particular places and times, the will itself is eternal and omnipresent. It is not located anywhere in particular because it is the inner essence of everything everywhere. It did not begin at any point in time and will not end at any future time, because time itself is just a form through which the will appears to our minds. The will simply is, without beginning or end, without location or duration. Second, the will is one and indivisible. While it appears to be divided into many separate individuals and objects, this division exists only in the world of representation. In itself, the will is a single unified force without parts or boundaries. This means that the distinctions we make between self and other, between different people and different things, are ultimately illusory. At the deepest level of reality, there is no multiplicity, no separation, no individuation. There is only the one will expressing itself through the infinite diversity of the representational world. Third, the will is blind and irrational. It does not have consciousness, intelligence, or purpose in the way we normally understand these terms. The will does not plan or choose or deliberate about what to do. Instead, it is pure striving, pure activity, pure force pushing always toward greater expression and manifestation. When we observe the apparent intelligence and purposiveness in nature, such as the intricate design of biological organisms or the precise movements of celestial bodies, we are not seeing the will's conscious planning. Instead, we are seeing the unconscious wisdom that emerges when a blind force operates according to eternal patterns and laws. Fourth, the will is characterized by constant striving without ultimate satisfaction. The will never reaches a final goal or achieves a permanent state of fulfillment. Each temporary satisfaction immediately gives rise to new wants and needs. A plant that successfully grows toward light immediately begins striving for nutrients, water, and reproductive opportunities. An animal that finds food immediately begins looking for more food, safer shelter, or suitable mates. A human being who achieves wealth, status, or love immediately discovers new desires and ambitions. The will is an endless cycle of wanting, temporary satisfaction, and renewed wanting. This characteristic of the will becomes the foundation for understanding why suffering is built into the very structure of existence. Schopenhauer's discovery of the will as the thing in itself had profound implications for understanding human nature and the human condition. It meant that what we normally think of as our individual self is actually a temporary and ultimately illusory manifestation of something much larger and more fundamental. Your personal identity, your individual desires and fears, your sense of being separate from others, all of this belongs to the world of representation. Your true essence is the universal will that you share with every other being in existence. Recognizing this truth, according to Schopenhauer, is the first step toward understanding the nature of suffering and the possibility of liberation from it. It reveals that the boundaries between self and world, between subject and object, between individual and universal, are not as solid as they appear to be. The practical implications of this insight extend into every aspect of human experience. When you feel competitive with others, you're forgetting that you and they are manifestations of the same underlying will. When you try to satisfy your desires through external achievements, you are seeking in the world of representation what can only be found by understanding the will. When you fear death, you are identifying yourself with your individual manifestation rather than recognizing your deeper identity with the eternal will. When you feel isolated and alone, you are taking seriously boundaries that exist only in the realm of appearance. Understanding the true relationship between will and representation becomes the foundation for a completely different way of experiencing life. Part 2. The Principle of Sufficient Reason. Before Schopenhauer developed his mature philosophy of will and representation, he wrote his doctoral dissertation on what he called the Principle of Sufficient Reason. This work, completed when he was only 22 years old, became the foundation for all his later philosophical insights. The principle of sufficient reason states that nothing exists or happens without a sufficient reason that explains why it exists or happens, rather than not existing or happening. This may sound like a simple and obvious truth, but Schopenhauer's detailed analysis of this principle revealed fundamental structures of human experience and knowledge. Schopenhauer identified 4 distinct roots or types of the principle of sufficient reason, each governing a different aspect of our experience. He argued that previous philosophers had failed to recognize these distinctions, leading to confusion and error in their systems. By carefully separating these 4 types, Schopenhauer believed he could clarify the nature of knowledge, causation, motivation, and logical reasoning. More importantly, this analysis would later help him understand the boundaries of rational knowledge and point toward the deeper reality of the will. The first root is the principle of sufficient reason of becoming, which governs our perception of physical objects and events in space and time. Every change or event in the physical world must have a cause that precedes it in time and explains why it occurred. When a billiard ball moves after being struck by another ball, the collision is the sufficient reason for its movement. When water boils after being heated, The application of heat is the sufficient reason for the phase change. This type of reasoning allows us to understand and predict physical phenomena by tracing chains of cause and effect. It is the foundation of all natural science and practical knowledge about the material world. However, Schopenhauer emphasized that this causal reasoning only applies to changes and events, not to the existence of objects themselves. We can explain why a particular stone falls when dropped, but we cannot use causal reasoning to explain why stones exist in the first place. Causation connects events in time, but it cannot account for the ultimate ground of existence itself. This limitation becomes important for understanding why scientific knowledge, no matter how complete, cannot answer the deepest questions about reality. Science can tell us how things happen and even predict what will happen, but it cannot tell us why anything exists at all. For that, we need a different kind of understanding entirely. The second route is the principle of sufficient reason of knowing, which governs logical reasoning and mathematical demonstration. Every valid conclusion must follow from premises that provide sufficient logical support for it. In mathematics, every theorem must be proven from axioms and previously established theorems using valid logical steps. In formal reasoning, every inference must follow rules that guarantee the truth of the conclusion given the truth of the premises. This type of reasoning deals with relationships between concepts and propositions rather than with events in time. It allows us to build systems of knowledge that are internally consistent and logically sound. Schopenhauer pointed out that logical reasoning is completely different from causal reasoning, though the two are often confused. A logical premise does not cause its conclusion in the way that one physical event causes another. Instead, logical reasoning reveals connections of meaning and implication that exist timelessly between concepts. When we say that all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal, we are not describing a sequence of events unfolding in time. Instead, we are recognizing a logical relationship that holds eternally between these concepts. Understanding this distinction helps clarify the difference between empirical knowledge based on experience and rational knowledge based on logical analysis. The third route is the principle of sufficient reason of being, which governs our awareness of space and time themselves. Every position in space and every moment in time must be determined by its relationships to other positions and moments. We can only identify a particular location by specifying its distance and direction from other locations. We can only identify a particular time by specifying its relationship to other times. Space and time are not containers that exist independently of the objects and events they contain. Instead, they are systems of relationships that allow us to organize our experience and distinguish one thing from another. This analysis led Schopenhauer to agree with Kant that space and time are forms of human intuition rather than features of reality, as it exists independently of our minds. We never experience objects without spatial and temporal properties, because spatiality and temporality are contributed by our own cognitive apparatus. The principle of sufficient reason of being explains how we construct the framework within which all other experience becomes possible. Without this framework, we could not distinguish between different objects, identify particular individuals, or track changes over time. But the framework itself is not something we discover in the world. It is something we bring to our experience of the world. This insight becomes crucial for understanding how the world of representation differs from the underlying reality of the will. The fourth root is the principle of sufficient reason of acting, which governs human motivation and behavior. Every human action must have a motive that explains why the person performed that action rather than some other action or no action at all. When someone goes to the store, there must be some want or need that motivated this behavior. When someone chooses one career over another, there must be reasons that made one option more appealing than the alternatives. This type of reasoning allows us to understand and predict human behavior by identifying the desires, beliefs and values that drive people to act. It is the foundation of practical psychology, ethics and social science. Schopenhauer emphasized that motives operate as causes in the realm of human action, but they work through the medium of consciousness rather than physical force. A motive must be represented in consciousness as something desirable or necessary before it can lead to action. This means that the same external situation might motivate different actions in different people, depending on how they perceive and evaluate the situation. A thunderstorm might motivate one person to seek shelter and another person to go outside and enjoy the dramatic weather. The difference lies not in the objective situation, but in how each person's consciousness interprets and responds to the situation. Understanding motivation requires understanding both external circumstances and internal mental processes. However, Schopenhauer argued that motives themselves arise from deeper sources that are not accessible to conscious reasoning. We can identify the immediate motives for our actions, but we cannot fully explain why we have the particular desires, fears and preferences that generate these motives. A person might know that they chose a particular career because they wanted financial security, but they cannot explain through reasoning alone why financial security matters to them more than other possible goals. These deeper motivational patterns emerge from what Schopenhauer would later identify as the will. The principle of sufficient reason of acting can trace the surface connections between conscious motives and actions, but it cannot penetrate to the unconscious source from which all motivation ultimately springs. This limitation points toward the need for a different kind of understanding that goes beyond rational analysis. Schopenhauer's analysis of these four roots revealed that the principle of sufficient reason applies only within the world of representation. Each type of reasoning operates by connecting representations to other representations according to specific rules and relationships. Causal reasoning connects events in time, logical reasoning connects concepts and propositions, spatial and temporal reasoning connects positions and moments, and motivational reasoning connects desires and actions. But none of these types of reasoning can take us beyond the realm of representation to the thing in itself. They can help us understand how representations are organized and related to each other, but they cannot explain why there are representations at all or what gives rise to the entire representational world. For that ultimate explanation, we need direct access to reality as it exists independently of all representational forms. This insight became crucial for Schopenhauer's later philosophy because it established the limits of rational knowledge while pointing toward a different kind of understanding. Rational knowledge, no matter how sophisticated, remains trapped within the world of representation. It can analyze, organize, and predict representational contents, but it cannot transcend representation itself. The deepest questions about existence, suffering, and liberation cannot be answered through rational analysis alone. They require a form of insight that bypasses the principle of sufficient reason and grasps reality directly. This direct insight into the will becomes the foundation for aesthetic experience, ethical understanding, and ultimate liberation from suffering. Part 3. The Platonic ideas and grades of objectification. Between the pure, undifferentiated will and the diverse world of individual objects and beings, Schopenhauer identified an intermediate level of reality that he called the Platonic ideas. These ideas, borrowed from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, serve as eternal patterns or archetypes that guide how the will manifests itself in the representational world. Understanding these ideas became crucial for Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory and his explanation of how artistic genius can penetrate beyond individual phenomena to grasp universal truths. The ideas also help explain why the natural world exhibits such remarkable order, beauty, and apparent purposiveness despite arising from a blind and irrational will. Schopenhauer described the ideas as the immediate objectifications of the will. While individual things in space and time are indirect objectifications that appear only through the organizing forms of human cognition, the ideas exist as direct expressions of the will's essential nature. Each idea represents a distinct way that the will can manifest itself, a fundamental pattern of activity that remains constant across all particular instances. The idea of gravity, for example, is the eternal pattern that governs how masses attract each other, manifesting identically in every particular gravitational interaction throughout the universe. The idea of the rose is the eternal pattern that governs how roses grow, bloom, and reproduce, manifesting in every individual rose that has ever existed or will exist. These ideas are not abstract concepts formed by human minds, but rather objective realities that exist independently of human thought and perception. Unlike the world of representation, the ideas exist outside of space, time, and causation. They are eternal and unchanging, not subject to the constant flux that characterizes individual phenomena. The idea of justice remains the same whether we are considering ancient societies or modern democracies. The idea of courage manifests identically in a medieval knight and a contemporary firefighter, despite the vast differences in their historical circumstances. Because the ideas transcend space and time, they can be fully present in each of their particular manifestations without being diminished or divided. Every individual rose expresses the complete idea of the rose, not just a part or aspect of it. Schopenhauer organized the ideas into a hierarchy of grades of objectification, ranging from the simplest physical forces to the most complex forms of consciousness. At the lowest grade are the fundamental forces of physics: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces. These forces operate blindly and mechanically, following simple laws that admit no exceptions. They represent the will in its most elementary form as pure striving without any trace of consciousness or individuality. A falling stone expresses the idea of gravity as completely and perfectly as the orbital motion of planets, with no awareness of what it is doing or why. At this level, the will objectifies itself as natural law, creating the basic structure within which all higher forms of manifestation become possible. The next grade includes the chemical forces that govern how different elements combine and separate. These forces are more complex than simple physical forces because they involve selective attractions and repulsions between different types of matter. A molecule of water forms because hydrogen and oxygen atoms have specific affinities for each other that do not extend to all other elements. Chemical processes show the first hint of discrimination and selectivity in the will's self-expression, though still without any consciousness of purpose or goal. The periodic table of elements represents a systematic catalogue of the different ways the will can objectify itself at this level. Each element has its own characteristic properties and behaviours that remain consistent across all instances throughout the universe. Higher up the hierarchy are the biological forces that govern living organisms. Here, the will objectifies itself as life processes: growth, nutrition, reproduction, adaptation to environmental conditions. Plants represent a significant advance over inorganic matter because they exhibit apparent purposiveness and goal-directed behaviour. A plant turns toward light, extends its roots toward water and nutrients, and coordinates its various organs to support overall health and reproduction. Yet plants lack consciousness and cannot form representations of their environment or their own needs. They embody the will's striving in a more organized and flexible form than inorganic matter, but still operate entirely through unconscious instinctual processes. Animal life represents an even higher grade of objectification because it adds consciousness and representation to the basic life processes. Animals can perceive their environment, form mental images of objects and situations, and modify their behavior based on learning and experience. They have desires, emotions, and individual personalities that distinguish one animal from another. A dog can recognize its owner, remember where food is hidden, and express joy, fear, or anger in response to different situations. Animal consciousness allows the will to respond more flexibly and intelligently to environmental challenges, but it also introduces the possibility of frustration, disappointment, and suffering. An animal can want something it cannot have, remember past pain, and anticipate future threats. Human consciousness represents the highest grade of objectification that we know about. Humans possess all the capabilities of animals, plus the distinctive ability to form abstract concepts, engage in logical reasoning, create works of art, and contemplate philosophical questions. Human consciousness can transcend immediate sensory experience and consider possibilities that do not currently exist. We can imagine alternative futures, learn from the experiences of others, and develop complex cultural institutions that persist across generations. But this enhanced consciousness comes at a price. Humans experience suffering more intensely and continuously than any other creatures we know about. Our ability to anticipate future problems, compare our situation to that of others, and contemplate abstract ideals of how life should be lived creates endless opportunities for dissatisfaction and anguish. Schopenhauer argued that each grade of objectification contains and builds upon all the lower grades. Human beings do not simply possess consciousness, they also contain within themselves all the physical, chemical, and biological processes that operate at lower grades. Our bodies are subject to gravity. Our cells depend on chemical reactions. Our organs carry out the same basic life functions as plants. Consciousness is added on top of these more fundamental processes, not substituted for them. This means that human nature is fundamentally complex and conflicted, pulled in different directions by different levels of the will's self-objectification. We experience physical needs like animals, but we also torture ourselves with abstract worries that no animal could conceive. The ideas that govern each grade of objectification are in constant competition with each other for the matter and energy available in the world. This competition creates all the conflict, struggle, and violence that we observe in nature. Different species compete for the same food sources, predators hunt prey, parasites exploit hosts, and even within single organisms, different needs and drives conflict with each other. A person might simultaneously want to eat rich food and maintain a healthy weight, pursue career success and spend time with family, seek excitement and maintain security. These conflicts arise because the will has objectified itself in multiple ideas that make incompatible demands on the same individual. There is no higher authority that can resolve these conflicts once and for all. They are built into the very structure of existence. However, Schopenhauer also recognized that the ideas themselves exist in perfect harmony with each other outside of space and time. The conflict appears only when the ideas manifest themselves in the world of representation, where different individuals must compete for limited resources. In their eternal reality, the ideas complement and support each other, forming a coherent system that expresses all possible ways the will can objectify itself. This insight becomes important for understanding aesthetic experience, where consciousness can temporarily transcend individual willing and contemplate the ideas directly. In such moments, we glimpse a reality beyond conflict, competition and suffering, a realm where all possibilities coexist in perfect peace. This aesthetic vision provides both a temporary escape from the struggles of ordinary life and a hint of the ultimate liberation that becomes possible through complete denial of the will. Part 4. The Nature of Human Suffering and Pessimism. Schopenhauer developed the most systematic and unflinching analysis of human suffering in the history of philosophy. He argued that suffering is not an accident, a side effect, or something that can be eliminated through social progress or technological advancement. Instead, suffering is woven into the very fabric of existence itself, emerging inevitably from the nature of the will and its manifestation in conscious beings. This insight formed the foundation of his philosophical pessimism, which holds that existence is fundamentally characterized by more pain than pleasure, more frustration than satisfaction, more struggle than peace. The primary source of suffering, according to Schopenhauer, lies in the essential nature of willing itself. To will means to want something that one does not currently possess, to strive toward a goal that has not yet been achieved. This means that willing necessarily involves a sense of lack, incompleteness, and dissatisfaction. When you are hungry, you suffer from the absence of food. When you are lonely, you suffer from the absence of companionship. When you are poor, you suffer from the absence of money. All willing begins with a negative state, a recognition that something is missing and drives toward the positive state of having or achieving what is desired. But the negative state of wanting is immediate and certain, while the positive state of satisfaction is temporary and uncertain. Schopenhauer observed that most of life is spent in the negative state of wanting rather than the positive state of having. We are hungry more often than we are eating, lonely more often than we are enjoying companionship, worried about money more often than we are spending it freely. Even when our basic needs are met, new desires and ambitions immediately arise to take the place of the ones that have been satisfied. A person who achieves financial security begins wanting social status. Someone who gains recognition starts desiring power. Someone who finds love becomes afraid of losing it. The will generates an endless succession of wants and needs that ensures we spend most of our lives in states of dissatisfaction and striving. Satisfaction, when it comes at all, is brief and quickly replaced by new forms of wanting. But even temporary satisfaction brings its own problems, according to Schopenhauer's analysis. When we get what we want, we discover that the reality rarely matches our expectations. The job we worked so hard to obtain turns out to involve tedious responsibilities we had not anticipated. The person we pursued so eagerly reveals character flaws that were not apparent during the courtship. The possession we saved money to buy quickly becomes familiar and loses its ability to provide excitement or pleasure. Moreover, achieving our goals often eliminates the sense of purpose and direction that the pursuit itself provided. We discover that we were more engaged and energized while striving toward our objectives than we are after reaching them. Success frequently leads to boredom, emptiness, and the question, now what? This led Schopenhauer to describe human life as swinging like a pendulum between the twin poles of want and boredom. When we lack what we desire, we suffer from want. When we possess what we desire, we suffer from boredom. There is no stable middle ground where we can rest in lasting contentment. The will ensures that we are always either lacking something important or finding that what we have is insufficient to provide enduring satisfaction. Even people who seem to have everything they could possibly want, such as wealthy celebrities or powerful politicians, frequently report high levels of anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness. External success cannot eliminate the internal structure of willing that creates suffering in the first place. Schopenhauer identified several specific ways that the will creates suffering beyond the basic pattern of wanting and temporary satisfaction. One of the most important is the way that desire distorts our perception of reality. When we want something intensely, we tend to idealize it, focusing on its attractive features while ignoring or minimizing its drawbacks. We imagine that obtaining the desired object will solve more problems and provide more happiness than it actually can. This systematic bias in perception ensures that we are regularly disappointed when reality fails to match our inflated expectations. The same process works in reverse with things we want to avoid. We exaggerate their negative qualities and underestimate our ability to cope with them if they occur. Another major source of suffering comes from the competitive nature of willing. Most of the things we want are scarce, which means that one person's success often requires another person's failure. There are limited positions at the top of any hierarchy, limited quantities of the most desirable goods, limited amounts of attention and admiration available from others. This scarcity transforms other people from potential allies into competitors and rivals. We find ourselves hoping for others to fail so that we can succeed, feeling threatened by others' achievements, and experiencing envy when others obtain what we want for ourselves. The will pits us against each other in ways that make genuine friendship, love, and cooperation difficult to sustain over time. Social life creates additional layers of suffering through what Schopenhauer called the hedgehog dilemma. Like hedgehogs trying to huddle together for warmth in winter, human beings need closeness and connection with others, but intimacy inevitably leads to conflict, irritation, and mutual harm. We want other people to understand and support us, but we also want them to respect our independence and individuality. We want to be loved for who we really are, but we also want to maintain privacy and control over how others see us. These conflicting needs make all relationships inherently unstable and prone to disappointment. We suffer when we are alone, but we also suffer when we are too close to others for too long. Schopenhauer also analyzed how consciousness itself multiplies suffering by allowing us to experience pain across different time periods simultaneously. Unlike animals, which suffer primarily from immediate physical discomfort, humans can suffer from memories of past pain and anticipation of future problems. We relive embarrassing moments from years ago, worry about career prospects decades in the future, and torment ourselves with regrets about roads not taken. Our ability to imagine alternative possibilities means that we can be dissatisfied not only with what we have, but also with what we might have had under different circumstances. A person who is reasonably successful might still be miserable because they compare themselves to those who are more successful, or because they imagine how much better their life could have been with different choices or opportunities. Consciousness transforms every temporary setback into a permanent source of potential anguish. The capacity for abstract thought also creates uniquely human forms of suffering that have no parallel in animal life. We suffer from existential anxiety about the meaning and purpose of our existence, from awareness of our own mortality, from the burden of moral responsibility for our actions. We create abstract ideals of how life should be lived, and then torture ourselves when reality falls short of these ideals. We develop complex belief systems about politics, religion, and philosophy, then suffer when events challenge these beliefs or when other people reject them. Animals may experience fear, hunger, and physical pain, but only humans experience guilt, shame, existential dread, and the peculiar agony of unfulfilled potential. The very capacities that make human life rich and meaningful also make it uniquely susceptible to sophisticated forms of misery. Despite this comprehensive analysis of suffering, Schopenhauer was not simply a gloomy pessimist who wanted to convince people that life was hopeless. Instead, he believed that honestly recognizing the extent and inevitability of suffering was the first step toward finding genuine solutions. Most attempts to eliminate suffering fail because they are based on false optimism about human nature and the nature of existence itself. They assume that suffering is caused by external conditions that can be changed rather than by the internal structure of willing that cannot be eliminated without a fundamental transformation of consciousness. Only by fully understanding why ordinary approaches to happiness are doomed to fail can we appreciate the value of the extraordinary approaches that Schopenhauer discovered in aesthetic experience, ethical insight, and ultimately the denial of the will to live. His pessimism was not an end in itself, but rather a diagnosis that made deeper healing possible. Part 5. The Illusion of Individuality and Maya. One of Schopenhauer's most profound and radical insights concerned the ultimate unreality of individual existence. He argued that our normal sense of being separate, distinct persons with clear boundaries between ourselves and others is a fundamental illusion created by the way our minds organize experience. This illusion, which he called by the Sanskrit term Maya, is not just a philosophical curiosity, but the root cause of most human suffering and the primary barrier to genuine ethical behavior and ultimate liberation. Understanding and eventually seeing through this illusion became central to Schopenhauer's vision of human transformation. The illusion of individuality arises from the organizing forms that our minds impose on all possible experience: space, time, and causation. These forms, which Schopenhauer learned about from Kant, make it inevitable that we perceive reality as consisting of many separate objects existing in different locations, persisting through different time periods, and standing in causal relationships with each other. When you look around a room, you automatically see distinct chairs, tables, walls, and other people, each occupying its own space and having its own separate existence. This way of organizing experience is so basic and automatic that it is almost impossible to imagine perceiving reality in any other way. Yet Schopenhauer argued that this entire structure of separateness and multiplicity exists only in the realm of appearance, not in reality itself. Behind the veil of Maya lies a completely different kind of existence, characterized by unity, timelessness, and the absence of individual boundaries. At the deepest level of reality, according to Schopenhauer, there is only one will manifesting itself through all the apparently separate phenomena we observe. Your individual will and every other person's individual will are actually the same underlying force appearing to be different because of the way consciousness structures experience. This means that the boundaries between self and other, between subject and object, between one person and another person, are not ontologically real. They are useful fictions that allow us to navigate the practical world, but they do not correspond to anything in the ultimate nature of things. When you harm another person, you are literally harming yourself, though the illusion of separateness prevents you from recognizing this truth. When you compete with others for scarce resources, you are engaging in a kind of cosmic civil war where one part of the will struggles against another part of the same will. Schopenhauer found powerful support for this insight in the philosophical traditions of ancient India, particularly in the Upanishads and the teachings of Buddhism. These traditions had long taught that individual existence is ultimately illusory, and that enlightenment consists in recognizing the fundamental unity that underlies apparent diversity. The Hindu concept of Atman, the true self that is identical in all beings, corresponds closely to Schopenhauer's understanding of the will as the inner essence of everything that exists. The Buddhist teaching of no self, or anatman, aligns with his insight that what we normally think of as our individual identity is a temporary construction rather than a permanent reality. Schopenhauer was one of the first major Western philosophers to take these Eastern teachings seriously and integrate them with European philosophical methods. He saw his own discoveries as providing rational justification for truths that Eastern sages had grasped through direct spiritual insight. The illusion of individuality operates through several specific mechanisms that Schopenhauer analyzed in detail. First, the organizing form of space creates the appearance that different objects and beings exist in separate locations with clear boundaries between them. In reality, space is not a container that exists independently of the objects it seems to contain, but rather a way that consciousness structures its experience of the unified will. The will itself exists nowhere in particular because it is the inner essence of everything everywhere. But when the will appears to consciousness, it must appear as spatial objects with definite locations, sizes, and shapes. This spatial organization automatically creates the impression of separateness and multiplicity, even though the underlying reality remains perfectly unified. Second, the organizing form of time creates the appearance that different beings have separate histories, experiences, and destinies. You seem to have lived through a unique sequence of events that defines your personal identity and distinguishes your story from everyone else's story. In temporal experience, you are born at a particular moment, grow up through childhood and adolescence, make specific choices that shape your adult life, and eventually face death as an event that ends your individual existence. But Schopenhauer argued that this entire temporal narrative exists only in the realm of representation. The will itself is eternal and timeless, neither born nor dying, neither changing nor developing through time. Your apparent birth was simply the will beginning to manifest through a particular bodily form, and your eventual death will be simply the will withdrawing from that form and continuing to manifest through countless others. Third, the organizing principle of causation creates the appearance that different individuals have separate causal powers and can affect each other from the outside. You seem to be an independent agent who can make free choices and influence the world around you through your actions. Other people seem to be external forces who can help or harm you, support or oppose your goals, love or reject you based on their own independent decisions. But according to Schopenhauer's analysis, all apparently separate causal agents are actually manifestations of the same underlying will. When one person helps another, it is the will helping itself. When one person harms another, it is the will harming itself. The entire drama of interpersonal relationships, with all its conflicts and reconciliations, is really the will interacting with itself through the medium of multiple apparent individuals. Understanding the illusory nature of individuality has profound practical implications for how we understand suffering, ethics, and the possibility of liberation. Most suffering arises from the ego's desperate attempts to maintain and enhance its separate existence in competition with other apparently separate egos. We suffer when our individual desires are frustrated, when our personal plans are thwarted, when our separate identity is threatened or criticized. But if individual identity is ultimately illusory, then this entire structure of ego-based suffering rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of what we really are. The ego that suffers is not our true nature. It is a temporary construction that arises from the way consciousness organizes experience. Recognizing this truth does not immediately eliminate suffering, but it does reveal that suffering is not as solid and inevitable as it normally appears to be. Similarly, ethical behavior becomes more natural and spontaneous when we see through the illusion of separateness. Most ethical systems rely on rules, duties, or consequences to motivate people to treat others well, despite their apparently conflicting interests. But if the boundaries between self and other are ultimately unreal, then harming others is literally self-defeating even from a purely selfish perspective. Compassion emerges naturally when we recognize other beings as manifestations of the same will that constitutes our own deepest nature. We do not need elaborate moral arguments to convince us to care about our own well-being. Similarly, we do not need elaborate arguments to care about others once we realize that they are not really other in any ultimate sense. Ethical behavior flows spontaneously from correct understanding rather than from moral obligation or external enforcement. The illusion of individuality also explains why most attempts at happiness and fulfillment are ultimately futile. The ego seeks satisfaction through accumulating possessions, achievements, relationships, and experiences that will enhance its separate existence and distinguish it from others. But since the ego is itself an illusion, all attempts to satisfy it are like trying to feed a mirage or shelter a shadow. No amount of external success can provide lasting fulfillment to something that does not ultimately exist as a separate entity. This is why even very successful people often report feeling empty, restless, and dissatisfied, despite having achieved everything they thought they wanted. They have been trying to satisfy an illusion, and illusions cannot be genuinely satisfied no matter how much external validation they receive. However, Schopenhauer emphasized that simply understanding the illusion of individuality intellectually is not sufficient to dissolve it experientially. The organizing forms of space, time, and causation operate automatically and unconsciously in all normal states of consciousness. Even when we intellectually accept that individuality is illusory, we continue to experience ourselves as separate beings in our day-to-day lives. Dissolving the illusion requires special states of consciousness that temporarily suspend or transcend the normal organizing forms. These states can be accessed through aesthetic contemplation, compassionate identification with others, and ultimately through the complete denial of the will to live. Each of these provides a glimpse beyond Maya into the underlying unity that is our true nature, though full and permanent liberation from the illusion remains extremely rare. Part 6. Art and Aesthetic Experience. Art provided Schopenhauer with his first major insight into how human consciousness could escape the tyranny of individual willing and glimpse the deeper reality beyond Maya. He developed the most systematic and influential theory of aesthetic experience in modern philosophy, arguing that genuine art allows us to transcend our ordinary, ego-driven consciousness and achieve a form of pure, disinterested contemplation. In aesthetic moments, we temporarily forget our individual identity with all its needs, fears, and desires, and become what Schopenhauer called pure subjects of knowing. This transformation provides both immediate relief from suffering and a foretaste of the ultimate liberation that becomes possible through complete denial of the will. Aesthetic experience begins when we encounter an object of beauty that captures our attention so completely that we lose awareness of everything else, including our own separate identity. This might happen while looking at a great painting, listening to a moving piece of music, reading profound poetry, or contemplating a magnificent natural scene. Suddenly the normal stream of thoughts, worries, plans and desires that usually fills consciousness simply stops. We are no longer thinking about our personal problems, our future goals, or our relationships with other people. Instead, we become completely absorbed in the pure perception of the beautiful object before us. Time seems to stop. The boundaries between subject and object begin to dissolve, and we experience a profound sense of peace and fulfillment that needs nothing more to complete it. During these moments of aesthetic contemplation, according to Schopenhauer's analysis, consciousness undergoes a fundamental transformation. Instead of perceiving particular objects existing in space and time and standing in causal relationships with other objects, we perceive the eternal ideas that these objects embody. When we look at a beautiful rose with aesthetic consciousness, we are not seeing this particular flower that will bloom for a few days and then wither. Instead, we are seeing the eternal idea of the rose, the timeless pattern that manifests identically in every rose that has ever existed or will exist. This idea exists outside of space, time, and causation, which is why aesthetic experience has a quality of timelessness and universality that ordinary perception lacks. We sense that what we are seeing is not just true for this moment and this location, but true always and everywhere. Similarly, when we experience aesthetic consciousness, we ourselves are transformed from individual willing subjects into pure universal subjects of knowing. The ordinary ego, with its personal history, particular desires and separate identity, temporarily disappears. What remains is pure consciousness itself, consciousness as such, without any individual colouring or limitation. This pure consciousness is the same in every person who experiences aesthetic contemplation, which is why great art can communicate across all barriers of culture, language, and historical period. The consciousness that appreciates beauty in a medieval cathedral is identical to the consciousness that appreciates beauty in a contemporary sculpture, even though the individual people having these experiences may be completely different in every other way. Aesthetic experience reveals the universal core of consciousness that underlies all apparent individual differences. Schopenhauer argued that different art forms provide access to different levels of the ideas and therefore offer different types of aesthetic experience. Architecture, the most basic art form, deals with the lowest grade of the will's objectification, the fundamental forces of physics like gravity, rigidity and cohesion. A beautiful building reveals the eternal ideas that govern how matter behaves under various conditions of weight, support and structural stress. When we appreciate architectural beauty, we are contemplating the pure mathematical relationships that determine how physical forces interact. Gothic cathedrals, for example, make visible the invisible forces of thrust and counterbalance that hold massive stone structures in perfect equilibrium. This creates a sense of wonder at the underlying order that governs the material world. Sculpture and painting deal with higher grades of objectification by representing living forms and human figures. Great sculpture captures the essential character types that appear repeatedly throughout human history: the hero, the sage, the mother, the lover, the warrior. When we look at a masterful statue, we see not just the individual person who served as a model, but the eternal human type that this person exemplifies. Similarly, great painting can reveal the inner essence of human emotions, relationships and life situations that transcend any particular cultural or historical context. A Renaissance painting of the Madonna and Child speaks to universal aspects of motherhood and divine love that are as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. These art forms help us see beyond the accidents of individual appearance to the timeless patterns that govern human nature. Poetry and literature work with concepts and language to reveal ideas that cannot be captured through visual representation alone. Great poetry distills complex emotional and philosophical insights into language that speaks directly to the universal aspects of human experience. When we read a profound poem, we recognize truths about love, loss, beauty, mortality, and meaning that we may have felt but never been able to articulate clearly. Literature can explore the full complexity of human psychology and social relationships, showing us eternal patterns of character and destiny that help us understand our own lives more deeply. The greatest works of literature, like Shakespeare's plays or Dostoevsky's novels, reveal aspects of human nature that remain constant across all cultural and historical differences. They help us see what is universal and permanent beneath the changing surface of social conditions and individual circumstances. But Schopenhauer reserved special recognition for music, which he considered the most direct and powerful form of art. Unlike other art forms, music does not represent particular objects or ideas at all. Instead, music bypasses representation entirely and gives us direct access to the will itself. When we listen to a great piece of music, we are experiencing the very essence of striving, satisfaction, conflict and resolution that constitutes the inner nature of all existence. Music expresses the fundamental emotions and life patterns that underlie all conscious experience: yearning, fulfillment, struggle, triumph, melancholy, joy. This is why music can move us so powerfully, even when we cannot explain in words what it means or why it affects us as it does. Different musical elements correspond to different aspects of the will's expression. The bass line represents the lowest grade of objectification, the fundamental forces that provide the foundation for everything else. The inner voices represent the animal and plant kingdoms, adding complexity and variety while remaining subordinate to the overall harmonic structure. The melody represents human consciousness with its capacity for individual expression and emotional development. The interaction between these different levels creates the same kind of harmony and conflict that we observe in nature, where different grades of objectification compete and cooperate in an ongoing cosmic drama. Great music reveals the essential structure of existence itself, not through concepts or images, but through direct, emotional and intuitive experience. Aesthetic experience provides genuine but temporary relief from the suffering that characterizes ordinary consciousness. During moments of pure contemplation, we are no longer driven by personal desires, no longer anxious about future outcomes, no longer tormented by comparisons with others. We experience a profound peace and fulfillment that needs nothing outside itself to be complete. This peace comes not from getting what we want, but from temporarily transcending the entire structure of wanting itself. Aesthetic consciousness shows us what it would be like to exist without the constant pressure of unfulfilled desires and unsatisfied needs. It provides a glimpse of the liberation that becomes possible when consciousness is no longer enslaved to the demands of individual willing. However, Schopenhauer emphasized that aesthetic experience, no matter how profound, remains temporary and incomplete. Eventually, we must return from aesthetic contemplation to ordinary consciousness, with all its practical demands and personal concerns. The hungry person who becomes absorbed in a beautiful painting will eventually remember their hunger. The anxious person who finds peace in music will eventually return to their worries. Aesthetic experience points toward ultimate liberation, but cannot by itself provide permanent escape from the cycle of willing and suffering. For that, we need a more complete transformation of consciousness that Schopenhauer found in ethical insight and ultimately in the denial of the will to live. But aesthetic experience remains valuable both for its own sake and as preparation for these deeper forms of liberation. Part 7. Ethics and Compassion. Schopenhauer's ethical philosophy flows directly from his understanding of the illusory nature of individual existence. If all beings are fundamentally manifestations of the same underlying will, then the basis for moral behavior becomes immediately clear. We should treat others with compassion because harming them literally constitutes harming ourselves. Compassion is not a sentiment we should cultivate for moral reasons or a duty we should fulfill to please God or society. Instead, compassion is the natural and spontaneous response that arises when we see through the veil of Maya and recognize other beings as sharing our deepest identity. Ethical behavior emerges from correct understanding rather than from moral rules, religious commands, or social pressure. This approach makes Schopenhauer's ethics both more naturalistic and more radical than traditional moral systems. The foundation of all genuine morality, according to Schopenhauer, lies in the direct, intuitive recognition that the suffering of others is as real and immediate as our own suffering. This recognition cannot be achieved through abstract reasoning or logical argument. We cannot convince someone to be compassionate by proving that compassion is rationally required, or by threatening punishment for selfish behavior. Instead, compassion must arise from a momentary dissolution of the boundaries between self and other, a flash of insight in which we directly experience another being's pain as our own pain. In such moments, the question, "Why should I care about others?" simply does not arise, any more than the question, "Why should I care about my own well-being?" The caring is immediate, automatic and undeniable because the apparent otherness that normally blocks compassion has temporarily disappeared. Schopenhauer identified two fundamental virtues that flow naturally from compassionate insight: justice and loving kindness. Justice consists in not harming others because we recognize that their suffering is identical to our own suffering. When we truly understand that another person's pain is as real and significant as our own pain, we naturally refrain from causing unnecessary harm. We do not need moral rules telling us not to hurt others. We simply lose the motivation to hurt them once we see that doing so would be self-defeating. A person who has achieved this level of insight treats others fairly not because fairness is morally required, but because unfairness no longer makes sense from their expanded perspective. They have seen through the illusion of separateness that makes exploitation and cruelty seem advantageous to the individual ego. Loving kindness goes beyond justice to include active efforts to help others and alleviate their suffering. While justice involves restraining ourselves from harmful actions, loving kindness motivates us to perform beneficial actions. A person who experiences others as manifestations of their own deepest nature naturally wants to promote their well-being, just as they naturally want to promote their own well-being. They help others not to gain reward or avoid punishment, but because others' happiness contributes directly to the total happiness of the unified will that constitutes their true identity. This form of altruism requires no sacrifice of self-interest, because the apparent conflict between self and other has been dissolved through correct understanding. What appears to be selfless generosity is actually an expression of enlightened self-interest that recognizes the fundamental unity underlying apparent diversity. Traditional ethical systems, according to Schopenhauer's analysis, fail because they try to motivate moral behavior through external incentives rather than through transformations of understanding. Religious ethics promises rewards in heaven and threatens punishments in hell for those who follow or violate moral commands. Utilitarian ethics argues that we should maximize overall happiness, because doing so will create the best consequences for society as a whole. Kantian ethics insists that we have rational duties to treat others with respect, regardless of our personal inclinations. All of these approaches assume that moral behavior requires us to act against our natural self-interest for the sake of some higher principle or external authority. But Schopenhauer argued that truly ethical behavior cannot be based on such external motivations because they leave the fundamental structure of egoism intact. A person who helps others only to gain heavenly rewards is still fundamentally selfish, just operating with a longer time horizon and a more sophisticated understanding of where their real interests lie. A person who sacrifices their own happiness for the greater good of society is performing a kind of moral heroism that few people can sustain over time. A person who treats others respectfully because reason demands it is suppressing their natural impulses through an act of will that requires constant effort and vigilance. All of these approaches create internal conflict between moral demands and personal desires, making ethical behavior feel artificial, burdensome, and ultimately unstable. Only when the fundamental illusion of separateness dissolves can moral behavior become natural, effortless, and sustainable. Compassion that arises from seeing through Maya requires no external motivation, because it expresses our deepest nature rather than contradicting it. Schopenhauer's ethical vision led him to become one of the first Western philosophers to advocate seriously for animal rights and environmental protection. If compassion should extend to all beings who can suffer, then it cannot stop arbitrarily at the boundaries of human species. Animals experience pain, fear, hunger and frustration just as humans do, and their capacity for suffering gives them the same fundamental claim to moral consideration. The fact that animals cannot engage in abstract reasoning or create complex cultural institutions does not make their suffering less real or less significant. A person who has truly seen through the illusion of separateness recognizes all sentient beings as manifestations of the same will that constitutes their own inner essence. Compassion naturally expands to include every creature capable of experiencing the states of wanting and satisfaction that define willing itself. This expansion of moral concern was radical for Schopenhauer's time and remains challenging even today. Most people find it easy to feel compassion for other humans, especially those who are similar to themselves in appearance, culture, and social status. Extending genuine compassion to people who are very different requires greater insight and moral development. Extending compassion to animals requires an even more complete transcendence of the ego's natural boundaries and preferences. Yet Schopenhauer argued that the capacity to feel genuine concern for animal welfare is actually a more reliable indicator of ethical development than conventional measures of moral respectability. A person who can recognize the reality of animal suffering has achieved a level of insight that transcends most forms of social conditioning and cultural prejudice. Schopenhauer also recognized that genuine compassion must be distinguished from mere sentimentality or emotional manipulation. Some people claim to feel deep concern for others, but use this concern to manipulate situations for their own advantage. Others experience intense emotional reactions to suffering, but use these reactions primarily to demonstrate their own moral sensitivity, rather than to help those who are actually suffering. True compassion, according to Schopenhauer, is characterized by practical effectiveness rather than dramatic emotional display. A genuinely compassionate person focuses on understanding what others actually need and finding realistic ways to provide it rather than on expressing their own feelings or gaining recognition for their moral superiority. They help others quietly and efficiently without calling attention to their generosity or expecting gratitude in return. The ethical insights that flow from seeing through Maya also transform how we understand justice, punishment, and social institutions. If individual identity is ultimately illusory, then the desire for revenge against those who have harmed us loses much of its force. We can still recognize that harmful actions need to be prevented and that social order requires consequences for antisocial behavior. But the passionate desire to make others suffer because they have made us suffer begins to seem pointless once we realize that all suffering affects the same underlying will. Punishment becomes a practical necessity for maintaining social cooperation, rather than a moral requirement for balancing cosmic accounts. This perspective leads to a more pragmatic and less vindictive approach to criminal justice and social policy. However, Schopenhauer emphasized that achieving the level of insight required for spontaneous compassion remains extremely rare. Most people remain trapped within the illusion of separateness throughout their entire lives, treating others well only when external incentives make it advantageous to do so. Even those who intellectually understand the illusory nature of individuality usually continue to experience themselves as separate beings in their day-to-day lives. Dissolving the barriers between self and other requires special moments of grace or insight that cannot be produced through effort alone. For this reason, conventional moral systems, with their rules, punishments, and social pressures, remain necessary for maintaining basic social order. But these systems should be understood as temporary expedients rather than ultimate truths about the nature of ethics. Part 8. The Denial of the Will to Live. The highest form of human development and the ultimate solution to the problem of suffering, according to Schopenhauer, involves a complete turning away from the will to live. This denial of the will represents the most radical transformation of consciousness possible, a state in which the individual no longer experiences any personal desires, ambitions, or attachments to existence itself. It is not suicide, which Schopenhauer considered a fundamental misunderstanding that actually affirms the will by violently rejecting life's conditions while still clinging to the desire for a better form of existence. Instead, denial of the will involves a gradual but complete loss of interest in all the things that normally motivate human behavior: pleasure, comfort, status, relationships, survival itself. This transformation represents the ultimate liberation from suffering, and the closest approximation to nirvana or salvation that human consciousness can achieve. Yet it remains so rare and difficult that Schopenhauer could point to only a few historical examples of individuals who had achieved it completely. The denial of the will typically begins with profound insight into the nature of existence and the futility of all ordinary forms of striving. A person who has seen clearly that willing necessarily involves suffering, that satisfaction is always temporary, and that individual identity is ultimately illusory, gradually loses motivation to pursue the goals that once seemed important. They realize that getting what they want will not provide lasting happiness, that achieving their ambitions will only create new ambitions, and that defending their ego against threats and competitors is a pointless battle that can never be definitively won. This realization is not merely intellectual, but involves a deep experiential understanding that transforms how they experience their own desires and motivations. What once seemed urgent and necessary begins to feel hollow and meaningless, like a game they no longer want to play. The will's demands continue to arise, but they no longer compel action, because the person has seen through their ultimate futility. As this insight deepens, the person begins to experience a fundamental shift in their relationship to their own body and its needs. They continue to maintain their physical health and meet their basic survival requirements, but without the usual anxiety, attachment, and ego investment that normally accompanies these activities. They eat when hungry and sleep when tired, but food and rest no longer provide the kind of satisfaction that makes life seem worthwhile. Sexual desire, which Schopenhauer considered the most powerful manifestation of the will to live, gradually diminishes and eventually disappears entirely. This is not repression or moral prohibition, but a natural loss of interest that occurs when the underlying will begins to turn away from life. The person may choose celibacy, but celibacy chooses them first through the spontaneous dissolution of sexual motivation. Social relationships also undergo radical transformation as the will denial deepens. The person loses interest in competing with others for status, resources, or recognition because they no longer identify with the individual ego that could benefit from such victories. They become genuinely indifferent to praise and blame, success and failure, admiration and contempt. This indifference is not coldness or withdrawal, but rather a profound peace that comes from no longer needing anything from the social world. They may continue to interact with others and even help them when the opportunity arises, but without any personal agenda or expectation of reciprocity. Their compassion becomes completely selfless because there is no longer a self to be served by compassionate actions. Material possessions and external achievements lose all appeal for someone who has denied the will to live. They may continue to use the basic necessities required for survival, but accumulating wealth, status symbols, or impressive accomplishments no longer provides any satisfaction. They realize that trying to enhance the ego through external acquisitions is like trying to improve a dream by rearranging the dream furniture. Since the ego itself is ultimately illusory, all attempts to serve its interests are equally illusory. This insight leads to a radical simplification of lifestyle and a complete loss of interest in the pursuits that consume most people's time and energy. The person lives simply not as a moral discipline, but because complexity and luxury no longer hold any attraction. Even the basic survival instinct begins to weaken as will denial reaches its completion. The person does not actively seek death, but they lose the intense attachment to life that makes most people fight desperately to preserve their existence. They become genuinely indifferent to whether they live or die, not because they are depressed or suicidal, but because they have seen through the illusion that makes individual survival seem important. If illness or accident threatens their life, they may take reasonable precautions, but without the fear and urgency that normally accompany such situations. Death becomes simply another event that may or may not occur, no more significant than any other change in the phenomenal world. This indifference to personal survival represents the ultimate transcendence of the ego's most fundamental concern. Schopenhauer found examples of this complete will denial primarily in the lives of Christian saints and Eastern ascetics who had achieved the highest levels of spiritual development. These individuals had renounced all worldly pleasures and ambitions, not as moral discipline, but because such renunciation had become natural and spontaneous. They practiced celibacy, poverty, and withdrawal from social involvement because they had lost all motivation for the activities these practices avoid. Their asceticism was not forced self-denial, but the external expression of an internal transformation that had eliminated the desires such practices typically struggle to control. They accepted suffering without complaint because they no longer identified with the individual self that suffers, and they faced death with equanimity because they had already transcended the ego that fears annihilation. Their lives demonstrated that complete liberation from the will to live is possible, though extremely rare. However, Schopenhauer emphasized that the denial of the will should not be understood as a goal to be pursued through deliberate effort. Trying to deny the will through force or discipline actually reinforces the very structure of willing that needs to be transcended. The person who struggles to overcome their desires is still fundamentally driven by desire, namely, the desire to be free from desire. This creates a paradox that cannot be resolved through increased effort or stronger determination. True will denial must arise spontaneously from complete understanding rather than from deliberate practice or moral striving. It is a gift of grace that may occur when insight into the nature of existence becomes so clear and complete that the will simply loses interest in its own continuation. For most people, complete denial of the will remains an impossible ideal rather than a realistic possibility. The best they can hope for are temporary experiences of will denial that occur during moments of aesthetic contemplation, compassionate identification with others, or profound philosophical insight. These moments provide valuable glimpses of what complete liberation would be like, and can motivate continued development in that direction. But permanent transcendence of all willing remains as rare as sainthood itself, achieved by perhaps one person in many millions. This rarity does not make the ideal worthless. Instead, it serves as the ultimate standard against which all other forms of human development can be measured. Even partial progress toward will denial can significantly reduce suffering and increase genuine peace and satisfaction. Schopenhauer acknowledged that his vision of ultimate liberation might seem pessimistic or nihilistic to those who remain attached to ordinary human goals and pleasures. From the perspective of normal consciousness, denying the will to live appears to involve giving up everything that makes existence worthwhile. But he argued that this perspective misunderstands both the nature of ordinary satisfaction and the nature of the peace that comes from transcending willing altogether. Ordinary pleasures are always temporary, always mixed with anxiety about their loss, and always followed by new desires that recreate the cycle of wanting and dissatisfaction. The peace that comes from will denial, by contrast, is permanent, complete, and needs nothing outside itself to remain fulfilled. It represents not the absence of something valuable, but the presence of the highest form of human development possible. Part 9. Views on Women, Sexuality and Love. Schopenhauer developed controversial and often problematic views about women, sexuality and romantic love that reflected both the social prejudices of his historical period and his broader philosophical insights about the nature of the will. While many of his specific claims about gender differences have been discredited by modern research, his analysis of how sexual desire functions as a manifestation of the will to live contains important insights that remain relevant today. Understanding these views requires separating his philosophical contributions from his personal biases and cultural limitations, recognizing both the value and the problems in his approach to these topics. His analysis reveals how the most intimate aspects of human experience serve the will's drive for survival and reproduction, often at the expense of individual happiness and rational decision-making. According to Schopenhauer's analysis, sexual attraction is the most powerful and deceptive manifestation of the will to live. When we fall in love, we experience intense emotions and desires that seem to be about our personal preferences and individual happiness. We believe we are choosing a particular person because of their unique qualities, and because being with them will make us happy. But Schopenhauer argued that this entire experience is actually the will's clever strategy for ensuring the continuation of the species. The will manipulates our consciousness by creating powerful attractions between individuals whose union will produce healthy offspring, even when such unions may not serve the long-term happiness of the individuals involved. Romantic love is thus a kind of cosmic deception that serves the species at the expense of the individual. This deception operates through what Schopenhauer called the metaphysics of sexual love, a process by which the will evaluates potential mates based on their ability to compensate for the deficiencies in our own genetic makeup. We are unconsciously attracted to people whose physical and mental characteristics will balance our own weaknesses and produce children who avoid our worst traits while preserving our best ones. A tall person may be attracted to someone shorter, an emotional person to someone more rational, an athletic person to someone more intellectual. These attractions feel like personal preferences, but they actually represent the will's biological programming for creating optimal offspring. The intensity of romantic passion corresponds to how important the genetic combination would be for the health and viability of potential children. The more complementary two people are genetically, the more overwhelming their mutual attraction becomes. Schopenhauer observed that this biological programming often conflicts with what would actually make individuals happy in long-term relationships. The same complementary differences that create intense sexual attraction may also create ongoing conflicts and incompatibilities in daily life. A person who is attracted to someone because they balance their weaknesses may find living with those same balancing qualities difficult and frustrating over time. The passionate lover who seems perfect during courtship may prove to be a challenging and incompatible life partner. This explains why so many marriages that begin with intense romantic love eventually deteriorate into mutual disappointment and resentment. The will has achieved its reproductive purpose, but the individuals involved discover that their personal happiness was never its primary concern. These insights led Schopenhauer to develop a deeply pessimistic view of marriage and family life. He argued that marriage typically involves a fundamental conflict between biological imperatives and individual well-being. The same drives that lead people to form families also trap them in situations that may limit their freedom, drain their resources, and prevent them from pursuing their authentic interests and development. Children represent the will's successful continuation into the next generation, but they also create enormous practical and emotional demands that can exhaust their parents' capacity for personal growth and fulfillment. Schopenhauer saw parenthood as one of the will's most effective strategies for ensuring that individuals remain focused on biological rather than spiritual concerns. The responsibilities of family life make it extremely difficult to achieve the kind of detachment and self-transcendence that liberation requires. Schopenhauer's views on women were heavily influenced by his belief that they are more closely connected to the will's biological imperatives than men. He argued that women's primary biological function as bearers and nurturers of children makes them more emotional, more focused on immediate practical concerns, and less capable of abstract intellectual pursuits. According to his analysis, women are naturally more skilled at understanding and manipulating interpersonal relationships because these skills serve the evolutionary purpose of securing resources and protection for their offspring. Men, by contrast, are more capable of detaching themselves from immediate biological concerns and pursuing abstract knowledge, artistic creation, and philosophical insight. These differences, he claimed, make women better suited for domestic life and men better suited for intellectual and cultural achievements. He saw these as natural complementary roles rather than arbitrary social conventions. However, it is crucial to understand that these views reflected the limited scientific knowledge and social assumptions of 19th-century Europe rather than objective philosophical insights. Schopenhauer had little contact with women who were educated or professionally accomplished, partly because such opportunities were severely restricted in his time and social class. His personal relationships with women were often difficult and unsuccessful, which may have influenced his theoretical conclusions about gender differences. Modern research has shown that most of the cognitive and emotional differences he attributed to biological sex are actually products of social conditioning, cultural expectations, and differential access to education and opportunities. Women and men show far more overlap than difference in their intellectual capabilities, emotional responses, and capacity for abstract reasoning. Contemporary philosophers generally appreciate Schopenhauer's insights about the will while rejecting his specific claims about gender. What remains valuable in Schopenhauer's analysis is his recognition that sexual desire often operates independently of, and sometimes contrary to, our conscious, rational judgments about what would make us happy. Modern psychology has confirmed that many aspects of attraction and mate selection are influenced by unconscious biological and evolutionary factors. We are often attracted to people for reasons we cannot fully explain or articulate, and these attractions may not align with our explicit criteria for what we want in a partner. The experience of falling in love does involve a temporary suspension of normal, rational evaluation that can lead people to make decisions they later regret. Understanding these dynamics can help individuals make more informed choices about relationships while recognizing the powerful forces that influence their romantic feelings. Schopenhauer's insight that sexual desire serves purposes beyond individual happiness remains relevant even when divorced from his problematic views about gender roles. Schopenhauer also analyzed how sexual desire creates various forms of suffering that extend beyond the individuals directly involved. Sexual jealousy, unrequited love, and competition for desirable partners generate enormous amounts of conflict, violence, and emotional pain throughout human societies. The same forces that create intense romantic passion also create intense romantic suffering when desires are frustrated or relationships fail. Moreover, the temporary nature of sexual attraction means that even successful romantic relationships often deteriorate over time, leaving individuals feeling betrayed by their own previous feelings. People who believed they had found their perfect match may discover that their feelings have changed or that their partner is no longer the person they fell in love with. These experiences of romantic disillusionment contribute significantly to the overall suffering that characterizes human existence. For those seeking liberation from the will, Schopenhauer recommended celibacy as both a means and a consequence of spiritual development. Sexual desire represents one of the will's most powerful and persistent demands, making it extremely difficult to achieve the detachment necessary for genuine self-transcendence. As long as a person remains sexually active, they remain entangled in the biological and emotional dynamics that keep consciousness focused on worldly concerns. However, he emphasized that celibacy must arise naturally from diminished sexual interest rather than being imposed through moral discipline or religious obligation. Forced celibacy often increases rather than decreases sexual preoccupation, while spontaneous celibacy indicates that the will is already beginning to turn away from life. For most people, complete sexual renunciation remains impossible, but understanding the role of sexuality in maintaining attachment to existence can help reduce its compulsive power. Despite his negative assessment of romantic love and sexuality, Schopenhauer acknowledged that these experiences can sometimes provide genuine insights into the nature of reality. The intensity of sexual passion can temporarily dissolve the ego boundaries that normally separate individuals from each other. In moments of deep romantic connection, people may experience a kind of unity and transcendence that resembles the peace found in aesthetic contemplation or ethical insight. However, he cautioned that this transcendence is usually temporary and ultimately serves to strengthen rather than weaken attachment to the will. Sexual union creates the illusion of overcoming separateness, while actually reinforcing the biological drives that maintain individual existence. True transcendence requires moving beyond, rather than more deeply into the realm of sexual experience. Part 10. Death, Suicide, and the Indestructibility of Being. Schopenhauer's analysis of death represents one of his most profound and consoling philosophical insights. He argued that what we normally think of as death, the cessation of individual existence, is actually a transformation that occurs entirely within the phenomenal world of representation. The deeper reality, the will itself, is neither born nor dies, but continues eternally, manifesting through endless forms and individual beings. Understanding this truth can liberate us from the fear of death that torments most human consciousness and helps explain why suicide, despite appearing to offer escape from suffering, actually misses the mark in addressing our deepest existential problems. Death becomes not the opposite of life, but simply another event within the eternal expression of the will, no more significant ultimately than falling asleep or changing clothes. This perspective radically transforms how we understand both mortality and the meaning of individual existence. When an individual person dies, according to Schopenhauer's analysis, what ceases to exist is only the particular phenomenal manifestation of the will that constituted that person's appearance in space and time. The organizing forms of consciousness that created the illusion of separate individual identity simply stop operating through that particular bodily form. But the will itself, which was the inner essence of that individual, continues unchanged and undiminished. It is like a wave subsiding back into the ocean. The wave disappears as a distinct formation, but the water that composed it remains part of the greater body from which it arose. Similarly, when we die, our individual personality and memories may cease, but our fundamental nature as manifestations of the universal will continues eternally. We do not go somewhere else or become something different. We simply stop appearing as separate individuals while remaining what we always truly were. This understanding reveals why the fear of death, though natural and almost universal, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what we really are. We fear death because we identify ourselves with our individual personality, our personal memories, our particular body and mind. The prospect of losing these individuating characteristics feels like complete annihilation, because we mistake them for our essential nature. But Schopenhauer argued that our true identity lies much deeper than these phenomenal characteristics. What we really are is the eternal will that has temporarily taken the form of this particular individual, but is not essentially limited to or defined by this form. Recognizing this deeper identity does not eliminate the natural reluctance to face bodily death, but it does remove the existential terror that comes from believing death represents total extinction. Schopenhauer supported this analysis by pointing to various forms of evidence for the indestructibility of our essential nature. He noted that we have no memory of the time before our birth, yet we do not consider that prior non-existence to have been a state of suffering or deprivation. If death simply returns us to the same condition we were in before birth, then death should be no more disturbing than that previous state of non-manifestation. The fact that we did not suffer before we were born suggests that we will not suffer after we die, at least not in any way that affects our current individual consciousness. The anxiety we feel about death comes from imagining it as a continuation of current consciousness in a state of deprivation. But this imagination itself reflects the confusion between our phenomenal and essential natures. What dies is only the appearance. What we essentially are was never born and therefore cannot die. He also observed that the same life force that animates our individual existence continues to animate countless other forms throughout nature. When we see new plants growing, animals being born, and young people reaching maturity, we are witnessing the same will that constitutes our own inner essence expressing itself through fresh manifestations. The energy and vitality that we experience in ourselves is not created when we are born or destroyed when we die. It is a temporary focusing of the universal life force that flows through all beings. In this sense, we are already participating in a kind of immortality through our connection to the ongoing creative activity of the will. Individual forms come and go, but the underlying reality that expresses itself through these forms is permanent and indestructible. Death represents not the end of our participation in this reality, but simply a change in the mode of our participation. This analysis led Schopenhauer to develop a complex and nuanced understanding of suicide that differed sharply from both religious condemnations and secular justifications of self-inflicted death. He argued that suicide is neither morally wrong in the sense of violating divine commands, nor philosophically correct as a solution to the problem of suffering. Instead, suicide represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of both suffering and liberation. The person who commits suicide still wants to live, but cannot tolerate the particular circumstances and conditions of their current existence. They are trying to escape the suffering that comes from willing, while still affirming the basic will to live that creates all suffering. Suicide destroys the manifestation while leaving the underlying cause of suffering completely intact. According to Schopenhauer's analysis, suicide attempts to solve the wrong problem through the wrong method. The real problem is not the external circumstances that make life difficult, but the internal structure of willing that makes satisfaction impossible regardless of circumstances. A person might commit suicide because of poverty, illness, romantic rejection, or social disgrace, but these external problems are merely occasions for suffering rather than its fundamental cause. Even if the suicide could magically eliminate these particular problems while preserving their life, new problems would inevitably arise because the will continues to generate dissatisfaction through its essential nature. The method of violent self-destruction also fails because it represents an act of will rather than the transcendence of willing that genuine liberation requires. Suicide is ultimately a passionate, willful response to suffering rather than the peaceful resignation that comes from true wisdom. However, Schopenhauer distinguished suicide from the gradual turning away from life that characterizes genuine denial of the will. The saint or sage who loses interest in continued existence does so without violence or desperation, simply allowing the will's attachment to individual life to fade naturally. This process involves no rejection of life's conditions, but rather a complete loss of motivation to fulfill life's demands. Such individuals may continue living for many years after achieving this state, maintaining their bodily existence without attachment while remaining completely indifferent to whether that existence continues or ceases. When death comes to such a person, it represents the natural completion of a process that began long before, rather than a violent interruption of ongoing desire and striving. This kind of death involves no suffering because there is no longer an individual ego to experience loss or dissolution. Schopenhauer also had great compassion for those who chose suicide while recognizing the philosophical errors that typically motivate such choices. He understood that the suffering which drives people to self-destruction can become so intense that rational considerations become impossible to maintain. A person in extreme psychological or physical pain may be incapable of the kind of philosophical reflection that reveals suicide's ultimate futility. Moreover, the very desperation that leads to suicide often prevents the person from accessing the deeper insights that could provide genuine relief from suffering. Schopenhauer never condemned suicide as a moral failing, but rather saw it as a tragic consequence of the human condition, combined with insufficient understanding of that condition's true nature. His analysis was intended to provide consolation and wisdom that might help prevent suicide, rather than to judge those who felt compelled to choose it. The understanding of death as transformation rather than annihilation also affects how we should view the deaths of others, particularly those we love. Grief is natural and appropriate when we lose someone who has been important to us, but excessive or prolonged grief may reflect the same misunderstanding about the nature of death that creates the fear of our own mortality. The person we loved has not ceased to exist, but has simply stopped manifesting in the particular form we knew and recognized. Their essential nature, the will that constituted their deepest identity, continues as part of the eternal reality that underlies all appearances. This does not mean that individual personality and memory survive death in some recognizable form, but it does mean that what was most fundamental about them has not been lost or destroyed. Understanding this truth can provide genuine comfort during bereavement, while honoring both the reality of our loss and the deeper reality that transcends all particular losses. Part 11. Religion, Buddhism and Christianity. Schopenhauer developed a complex and nuanced relationship with religious thought that distinguished him from most other philosophers of his era. While he rejected the anthropomorphic theism of traditional European Christianity, he found profound wisdom in the mystical and ascetic traditions of various religions, particularly Buddhism and the contemplative branches of Christianity. He believed that the great religious teachers had arrived at essentially the same insights about human nature and liberation that he had reached through purely philosophical reasoning. Religion, at its best, according to Schopenhauer, provides practical guidance for transcending suffering and achieving peace, while religion, at its worst, becomes a system of social control that obscures rather than reveals fundamental truths about existence. His approach allowed him to appreciate religious wisdom, while maintaining his commitment to rational inquiry and philosophical independence. This synthesis of Eastern and Western religious and philosophical perspectives became one of his most original and influential contributions to human thought. Buddhism held a special place in Schopenhauer's philosophical system because he saw it as the most accurate and systematic religious expression of truths he had discovered independently. The Buddha's Four Noble Truths aligned remarkably closely with Schopenhauer's own analysis of the human condition. The first noble truth, that life is characterized by suffering, corresponded to his pessimistic assessment of existence under the dominion of the will. The second noble truth, that suffering arises from craving and attachment, matched his understanding of how willing necessarily creates dissatisfaction and frustration. The third noble truth, that it is possible to escape suffering by eliminating its cause, paralleled his vision of liberation through the denial of the will to live. The fourth noble truth, outlining the path to this liberation, resembled his account of how aesthetic experience, ethical insight, and ascetic practice can lead to transcendence of ordinary consciousness. Schopenhauer was particularly impressed by the Buddhist concept of nirvana, which he interpreted as the complete extinction of individual willing and the achievement of perfect peace. Unlike the Christian heaven, which promised eternal happiness for the individual soul, nirvana represented the dissolution of individuality itself into a state beyond all particular desires and satisfactions. This aligned perfectly with his understanding that liberation requires not the fulfillment of the will, but its complete transcendence. He saw the Buddhist emphasis on meditation, detachment, and the recognition of impermanence as practical methods for achieving the kind of consciousness transformation he described philosophically. The Buddhist teaching that all individual existence is ultimately illusory corresponded to his insight about Maya and the phenomenal nature of separation. He often quoted Buddhist texts and considered himself to be providing a rational Western foundation for truths that Buddhism had preserved through centuries of contemplative practice. However, Schopenhauer also recognized important differences between his philosophical approach and traditional Buddhist teachings. Buddhism typically presents its insights within a religious framework that includes beliefs about karma, rebirth and cosmic justice that Schopenhauer could not accept on purely rational grounds. While he found these concepts useful as metaphors for understanding the continuity of the will across different manifestations, he could not endorse them as literal truths about individual survival after death. He appreciated Buddhist ethics and psychology while remaining skeptical about Buddhist cosmology and metaphysics. Similarly, he valued Buddhist meditation practices as means for achieving the kind of consciousness transformation he advocated, but he insisted that such practices should be understood in philosophical rather than supernatural terms. His approach was to extract the essential insights from Buddhism while translating them into language and concepts that could withstand rational scrutiny. Schopenhauer's relationship with Christianity was more complex and ambivalent than his appreciation for Buddhism. He strongly rejected the mainstream Christian emphasis on a personal God who created the world, judges human actions, and intervenes in natural processes. He considered such anthropomorphic theism to be a sophisticated form of mythology that reflected human psychological needs rather than objective truth about reality. The Christian promise of eternal reward and punishment seemed to him to perpetuate rather than transcend the ego-based consciousness that creates suffering in the first place. Moreover, he was deeply critical of organized Christianity's historical involvement in political power, social oppression, and intellectual censorship. He saw institutional Christianity as often contradicting the very teachings it claimed to represent. Nevertheless, Schopenhauer found profound wisdom in the mystical and ascetic traditions within Christianity, particularly in the lives and writings of saints who had achieved genuine transcendence of worldly concerns. He admired figures like Meister Eckhart, whose teachings about the dissolution of individual will in union with the divine paralleled his own insights about the denial of the will to live. The Christian emphasis on love, compassion and self-sacrifice resonated with his understanding of ethics as arising from the recognition of fundamental unity beneath apparent separation. He saw the Christian teaching that we should love our neighbours as ourselves as an expression of the literal truth that self and other are ultimately identical. The Christian ideal of renouncing worldly pleasures and ambitions aligned with his vision of liberation through the gradual loss of interest in all forms of willing. What he objected to was not these essential insights, but rather their embedding within a theological framework that he considered rationally untenable. Schopenhauer argued that the greatest religious teachers throughout history had achieved direct insight into the nature of reality through contemplative practice, and had then expressed these insights using the cultural and conceptual resources available to them. The Buddha, Jesus, and other enlightened figures had experienced the same fundamental truths about suffering, compassion, and liberation. But they had articulated these truths using different symbols, stories, and theoretical frameworks. The diversity of religious traditions reflected not contradictory claims about reality, but rather different cultural expressions of the same underlying wisdom. This perspective allowed Schopenhauer to appreciate the essential teachings of various religions while remaining critical of their particular dogmas and institutional forms. He saw his own philosophy as providing a universal rational foundation that could unify the best insights from different religious traditions while eliminating their culturally specific and rationally problematic elements. Philosophy and religion at their best were addressing the same fundamental questions and arriving at compatible answers. This approach led Schopenhauer to develop what might be called a philosophical religion that combined rational analysis with contemplative practice. He believed that intellectual understanding of the nature of willing and representation needed to be supplemented by direct experiential insight into these truths. Reading about the illusion of individuality is not the same as experiencing the dissolution of ego boundaries. Understanding the futility of willing is not the same as losing motivation for worldly pursuits. Religious practices like meditation, contemplation and ascetic discipline could help bridge the gap between intellectual knowledge and lived realization. However, he insisted that such practices should be undertaken with full rational understanding of their purpose and methods, rather than as acts of faith in supernatural doctrines. The goal was not to please a deity or earn rewards in another life, but to achieve the kind of consciousness transformation that brings immediate peace and freedom from suffering. Schopenhauer's appreciation for religious wisdom also influenced his critique of the shallow optimism and materialistic focus of much Enlightenment thought. While he valued reason and scientific inquiry, he believed that purely secular philosophies often ignored the deeper questions about meaning, suffering, and transcendence that religious traditions had kept alive. The Enlightenment emphasis on progress, happiness, and worldly achievement seemed to him to perpetuate the very illusions that caused human misery. Religious traditions, despite their theoretical limitations, had at least recognized that ordinary consciousness and conventional values were inadequate for addressing the deepest human needs. They had preserved practices and insights that could help individuals transcend the ego-based perspective that creates most suffering. Schopenhauer saw his philosophy as continuing this religious concern with ultimate questions while updating the methods and concepts used to address them. However, Schopenhauer also warned against the dangers of religious fanaticism, dogmatism, and institutional corruption that had historically accompanied organized religion. When religious insights became codified into rigid doctrines that believers were expected to accept without question, religion lost its capacity to promote genuine understanding and transformation. When religious institutions became vehicles for political power and social control, they often acted directly contrary to the compassionate teachings they claimed to represent. When religious practices became mechanical rituals performed out of habit or social pressure rather than genuine seeking, they ceased to serve their original purpose of promoting liberation. Schopenhauer advocated for a return to the essential spirit of religion while rejecting its accidental historical accumulations of superstition, power-seeking, and intellectual dishonesty. True religion, like true philosophy, required complete honesty, intellectual courage, and willingness to follow insights wherever they might lead. The synthesis of philosophical and religious perspectives that Schopenhauer achieved had a profound influence on later thinkers who were seeking alternatives to both dogmatic religion and shallow materialism. His approach showed that it was possible to appreciate the wisdom of religious traditions without accepting their supernatural claims, and to pursue spiritual development without abandoning rational inquiry. This model influenced writers, artists, and philosophers who were drawn to the contemplative aspects of religion but could not accept traditional theological frameworks. It also contributed to the growing Western interest in Eastern philosophy and meditation practices that accelerated throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Schopenhauer demonstrated that the encounter between Western rational thought and Eastern contemplative wisdom could be mutually enriching rather than necessarily contradictory. His work helped establish the possibility of a philosophically informed spirituality that honored both the insights of reason and the wisdom of contemplative experience. Part 12. Knowledge, Science and Empirical Understanding. Schopenhauer developed a sophisticated theory of knowledge that examined both the possibilities and limitations of human understanding. He built upon Kant's insights about the role of mental categories in organizing experience while going beyond Kant to identify the will as the ultimate source of all knowledge and the key to understanding reality itself. His analysis revealed how scientific knowledge, despite its practical success and theoretical sophistication, remains trapped within the realm of representation and cannot penetrate to the essence of things. At the same time, he recognized science as the highest form of rational knowledge and valued its ability to reveal the patterns and connections that govern the phenomenal world. Understanding the scope and limits of scientific knowledge became crucial for his broader philosophical project of pointing beyond rational analysis toward direct insight into the nature of the will. His theory of knowledge provided the epistemological foundation for his entire philosophical system, while explaining why that system ultimately required forms of understanding that transcend ordinary rational thought. All human knowledge, according to Schopenhauer's analysis, begins with intuitive perception of individual objects in space and time. This perceptual knowledge is immediate, concrete, and rich in detail, but it remains limited to particular things and events that we encounter through our senses. When we see a tree, hear a sound, or feel a texture, we are gaining direct acquaintance with specific manifestations of the will, but we are not yet understanding the general principles or universal laws that govern such manifestations. Perceptual knowledge provides the raw material for all higher forms of understanding, but by itself it cannot explain, predict, or systematically organize what we experience. For that, we need the distinctively human capacity for abstract conceptual thought that allows us to move beyond immediate perception to general knowledge about classes of objects and types of relationships. This transition from intuitive to abstract knowledge represents both a gain in generality and scope and a loss in immediacy and concreteness. Conceptual knowledge operates by grouping particular perceptions into general categories and identifying the relationships between these categories. When we form the concept tree, we abstract from all the specific differences between individual trees to focus on their common characteristics. This allows us to think about trees in general, rather than being limited to whatever particular trees we happen to encounter. We can make statements like, trees require sunlight to grow that apply to all trees everywhere, not just to the specific trees we have observed. Conceptual knowledge thus gains universality and predictive power by sacrificing the rich particularity of immediate perception. We can think about thousands of trees through the single concept tree, but the concept itself contains far less information about any particular tree than direct perception of that tree would provide. Science represents the highest development of conceptual knowledge through its systematic search for universal laws and causal explanations. Scientific investigation identifies the regular patterns that govern natural phenomena and expresses these patterns in precise mathematical formulations. When physics discovers that force equals mass times acceleration, it is revealing a universal relationship that applies to all physical interactions regardless of their particular circumstances. When chemistry identifies the atomic structure of different elements, it is uncovering the fundamental principles that explain why different substances behave as they do. When biology discovers the mechanisms of heredity and evolution, it is revealing the universal processes that govern all living systems. Scientific knowledge thus achieves remarkable scope and precision by identifying the abstract mathematical and logical structures that underlie the apparent diversity of natural phenomena. However, Schopenhauer argued that scientific knowledge, no matter how complete and sophisticated, remains fundamentally limited by its restriction to the realm of representation. Science can discover how phenomena are related to each other through space, time, and causation, but it cannot explain why there are phenomena at all, or what gives rise to the entire representational world. It can trace causal connections between events and identify the mathematical laws that govern these connections, but it cannot penetrate to the inner essence of the forces that manifest through these laws. Physics can describe gravitational attraction with extraordinary precision, but it cannot tell us what gravity actually is beyond its measurable effects. Biology can map the mechanisms of life processes in remarkable detail, but it cannot explain what life itself is beyond its observable manifestation. Science operates entirely within the world of appearances and has no access to the thing in itself that underlies all appearances. This limitation becomes particularly evident when science attempts to understand consciousness and subjective experience. Neuroscience can map the brain processes that correlate with different mental states and can even predict some aspects of behavior based on brain activity. But it cannot explain how objective neural events give rise to subjective experiences, like the redness of red, the pain of pain, or the feeling of love. The scientific method is designed to study objective, measurable phenomena that can be observed from the outside. Consciousness, however, is inherently subjective and can only be known from the inside, from the first-person perspective of the experiencing subject. This means that consciousness will always remain partially mysterious to scientific investigation, no matter how sophisticated our measurement techniques and theoretical models become. Schopenhauer argued that understanding this limitation of science is crucial for maintaining proper humility about what human reason can achieve. Scientific knowledge is extremely valuable within its proper domain, but it becomes misleading when it claims to provide complete explanations of reality. Materialistic worldviews that attempt to reduce everything to physical processes operating according to scientific laws are committing a category error. They are mistaking the realm of representation for the whole of reality and forgetting that scientific laws themselves are mental constructs that organize our experience rather than fundamental features of existence itself. This does not make science worthless or unreliable, but it does mean that science must be supplemented by other forms of understanding if we want to address the deepest questions about the nature of existence. Science can tell us how the world appears to our minds, but it cannot tell us what the world is in itself or why it appears at all. The recognition of science's limitations also helps explain why purely scientific approaches to human problems often fail to provide genuine solutions. Scientific psychology can identify the brain mechanisms involved in depression, but this knowledge by itself does not necessarily help depressed individuals find meaning and peace. Scientific sociology can analyze the social forces that create inequality and conflict, but this analysis does not automatically provide wisdom about how to live well in an imperfect world. Scientific medicine can treat many diseases and extend human life, but it cannot address the existential questions about suffering and mortality that affect everyone regardless of their physical health. These deeper human concerns require forms of understanding that go beyond scientific analysis to include philosophical insight, contemplative wisdom, and direct experience of the fundamental nature of consciousness. Science provides crucial tools for navigating the practical world, but it cannot replace the inner work of self-understanding and spiritual development that addresses suffering at its root. Schopenhauer also analyzed how scientific knowledge relates to artistic and philosophical understanding. Science deals with the universal laws and general principles that govern classes of phenomena, while art reveals the eternal ideas that manifest through particular individuals. A scientific study of roses might investigate their cellular structure, genetic mechanisms, and evolutionary history, while an artistic representation of a rose might capture the timeless essence of beauty, growth, and natural perfection that roses embody. Both forms of knowledge are valuable, but they serve different purposes and provide different types of insight. Science helps us understand and manipulate the natural world, while art helps us appreciate and contemplate the deeper significance of existence. Philosophy attempts to synthesize these different approaches by providing rational analysis of the ultimate questions that science cannot address, and that art can only suggest through symbols and images. The proper relationship between science and philosophy, according to Schopenhauer, involves mutual respect and appropriate division of labor. Science should be free to investigate natural phenomena using empirical methods without interference from philosophical preconceptions about what it should discover. Philosophy should be free to address ultimate questions about meaning, value, and the nature of existence without being constrained by the methodological limitations that science must accept. Both enterprises can inform and enrich each other without either one claiming authority over the other's proper domain. Scientists who ignore philosophical questions about the nature and limits of knowledge may fall into naive realism or reductive materialism. Philosophers who ignore scientific discoveries about the natural world may develop theories that are disconnected from empirical reality. The ideal approach combines scientific rigor in investigating phenomena with philosophical depth in reflecting on the significance and limitations of such investigations. This synthesis allows us to appreciate both the power and the limits of human reason, while remaining open to forms of understanding that transcend rational analysis altogether. Part 13. Genius, Talent and Intellectual Capability. Schopenhauer developed a distinctive theory of genius that connected intellectual and artistic excellence to the capacity for transcending ordinary ego-driven consciousness. He argued that genius involves the rare ability to perceive the eternal ideas directly rather than being limited to particular objects and personal interests. This capacity allows genuinely gifted individuals to create works of art, literature and philosophy that speak to universal aspects of human experience and reveal truths that remain hidden from ordinary consciousness. Genius is not simply high intelligence or technical skill, though it may include these qualities, but rather a special form of consciousness that can temporarily escape the tyranny of individual willing and achieve pure, disinterested contemplation. Understanding the nature of genius helps explain both the greatness and the frequent unhappiness of exceptionally gifted individuals, while also illuminating the relationship between intellectual achievement and spiritual development. Schopenhauer's analysis reveals why true genius is so rare and why it often appears in forms that conventional society finds difficult to understand or appreciate. The essential characteristic of genius, according to Schopenhauer's analysis, is the ability to perceive universal patterns and eternal truths rather than being limited to immediate personal concerns and practical necessities. Most people experience the world primarily in terms of how it affects their individual interests, needs and desires. They notice things that might be useful, threatening or relevant to their personal goals, but they tend to overlook aspects of reality that have no obvious connection to their individual welfare. A person of genius, by contrast, can become so completely absorbed in contemplating an object or idea that they temporarily forget their personal identity and circumstances. They see beyond the particular characteristics that make something useful or harmful to themselves and grasp the universal principles that govern entire classes of phenomena. This shift from personal to universal perspective allows them to recognize patterns and relationships that remain invisible to more practically oriented minds. In artistic genius, this capacity manifests as the ability to perceive and represent the eternal ideas that underlie the constantly changing world of particular objects and events. A great painter does not simply copy the visual appearance of specific people or landscapes, but captures the essential character types and natural forms that these particulars exemplify. When we look at a masterful portrait, we see not just the individual person who served as a model, but the universal human qualities that this person embodies: nobility, wisdom, innocence, determination, melancholy. Similarly, a great landscape painting reveals not just a particular place at a particular time, but the eternal ideas of mountain, forest, sky and water that make all such places beautiful and significant. The artistic genius has the rare gift of seeing through the veil of individuation to the timeless patterns that govern both natural forms and human character. This allows them to create works that speak to people across all cultural and historical differences because they are expressing truths about the permanent structures of reality itself. Literary genius operates through language and narrative to reveal the universal patterns that govern human psychology, relationships, and moral development. A great novelist like Shakespeare or Dostoevsky creates characters who embody eternal human types while also remaining psychologically convincing as particular individuals. We recognize Hamlet, Lady Macbeth or Raskolnikov as specific people with unique histories and circumstances, but we also see in them universal patterns of ambition, guilt, intellectual torment and moral struggle that illuminate our own experience. Great literature helps us understand the hidden motivations and unconscious processes that drive human behavior by revealing them in clear, dramatic form. It shows us what we are like beneath the surface appearances we present to ourselves and others, often revealing truths about human nature that we would prefer not to acknowledge. Literary genius thus serves both aesthetic and psychological functions, creating beauty while also promoting self-knowledge and moral insight. Philosophical genius involves the capacity to penetrate through conventional opinions and surface appearances to the fundamental principles that govern existence itself. Most people accept the world as it appears and adopt the beliefs and values that their culture provides without questioning their ultimate foundation or validity. Philosophical genius, however, cannot rest satisfied with inherited wisdom or common sense assumptions. It compels individuals to ask the deepest questions about reality, knowledge, morality and meaning, pursuing these questions with relentless honesty regardless of where they might lead. Great philosophers like Plato, Kant, or Schopenhauer himself develop entirely new ways of understanding fundamental issues that had previously been taken for granted or inadequately analyzed. They create conceptual frameworks that illuminate aspects of experience that had remained hidden or confused, often revealing that our ordinary assumptions about reality are systematically misleading. However, Schopenhauer emphasized that genius always comes at a significant personal cost because it involves a kind of consciousness that is poorly adapted to the practical demands of ordinary life. People of genius tend to be absorbed in the contemplation of universal truths, rather than focused on immediate personal advantages and social success. They may neglect their health, finances, and relationships, while pursuing insights that seem more important to them than conventional forms of achievement. Their ability to see beyond conventional perspectives also makes them critical of social institutions and cultural values that most people accept, without question. This critical stance often creates conflict with family members, colleagues, and social authorities who prefer conformity to innovation. Moreover, the same sensitivity that allows genius to perceive subtle truths and create beautiful works also makes these individuals more vulnerable to suffering from the harsh realities of existence. Schopenhauer distinguished between genuine genius and mere talent, though he recognized that this distinction can be difficult to make in practice. Talent involves high skill in applying established methods and techniques to achieve recognized goals within existing frameworks. A talented musician can perform difficult pieces with technical excellence. A talented scientist can conduct sophisticated experiments and analyze complex data. A talented writer can craft entertaining stories using proven narrative techniques. But talent operates within boundaries that have been established by others and aims at achievements that are already understood and valued by society. Genius, by contrast, transcends these boundaries by discovering entirely new possibilities and creating original frameworks for understanding or expression. Genius does not simply do well what others have done before, it does what no one has previously imagined could be done. This difference helps explain why genius is often underappreciated or even rejected during the lifetime of those who possess it. Society has established institutions and criteria for recognizing and rewarding talent because talented individuals contribute to goals that are already understood and valued. But genius challenges these established frameworks and creates works that cannot be evaluated using existing standards. The innovations of genius may seem strange, disturbing, or irrelevant to contemporaries who lack the perspective necessary to appreciate their significance. Only later, when society has developed new frameworks for understanding, do the contributions of genius receive proper recognition. This pattern explains why many of the greatest artists, writers, and philosophers achieved fame only after their deaths, while less innovative but more conventional figures received contemporary acclaim. Schopenhauer also analyzed the relationship between genius and madness, noting that both involve departures from ordinary consciousness and conventional social adaptation. However, he argued that genius and madness move in opposite directions from the normal state of mind. Madness involves an excessive fixation on particular ideas, memories, or perceptions that prevents the person from maintaining contact with shared reality. The mad person cannot escape from their private obsessions to engage effectively with the objective world that others experience. Genius, by contrast, involves an exceptional ability to transcend personal obsessions and achieve objective, universal perspective. The person of genius moves beyond private interests and subjective biases to grasp truths that are valid for everyone, even though these truths may not be immediately apparent to everyone. Both genius and madness represent forms of consciousness that are incompatible with ordinary social functioning, but genius moves toward greater objectivity, while madness moves toward greater subjectivity. This distinction helps explain why genius produces works of lasting value, while madness typically produces only confusion and suffering. The rarity of genuine genius also reflects the rarity of the consciousness transformation that makes such achievement possible. Most people remain trapped within the perspective of individual willing throughout their entire lives, focused primarily on satisfying personal desires and protecting ego interests. The capacity to transcend this perspective temporarily and achieve pure contemplation of universal truths requires an unusual combination of intellectual ability, emotional detachment, and spiritual insight. It involves the same kind of consciousness transformation that Schopenhauer identified in aesthetic experience and ethical development, but sustained over longer periods and directed toward creative or philosophical activity. For this reason, genuine genius often accompanies other forms of spiritual development and may serve as preparation for the even rarer achievement of complete will denial. The person who can transcend individual perspective to create universal art or philosophy has already taken significant steps toward the ultimate transcendence that constitutes the highest human possibility. Part 14. Political Philosophy and Social Critique. Schopenhauer's political philosophy emerged directly from his understanding of human nature as fundamentally driven by the blind, competitive striving of the will. Unlike philosophers who believed that social problems could be solved through better institutions, education, or economic arrangements, Schopenhauer argued that political conflict and social inequality are inevitable consequences of the way consciousness is structured. He rejected both optimistic liberal theories that promise progress through reason and democratic participation, and revolutionary socialist theories that promised equality through economic transformation. Instead, he advocated for realistic political arrangements that could minimize harm and maintain basic order, while recognizing that no political system could eliminate the suffering and conflict that arise from the fundamental nature of willing itself. His political thought was conservative in its skepticism about human perfectibility, but humanitarian in its concern for reducing unnecessary suffering. This combination of pessimistic realism and compassionate concern created a distinctive approach to political questions that influenced later thinkers while remaining outside the mainstream of both progressive and reactionary political movements. The foundation of Schopenhauer's political analysis lay in his understanding that individual human beings are fundamentally separate willing entities who must compete for limited resources and opportunities. While philosophical insight might reveal that this separateness is ultimately illusory, most people remain trapped within the perspective of individual ego throughout their political lives. They naturally pursue their own interests and those of their families, tribes and nations, often at the expense of others who are competing for the same advantages. This competitive dynamic creates inevitable conflicts that no amount of moral education or institutional reform can completely eliminate. Even people who intellectually understand the importance of cooperation and mutual aid find it difficult to resist the immediate pressures of self-interest when their own welfare or that of their loved ones appears to be at stake. Political institutions must therefore be designed to work with human nature as it actually is, rather than as idealistic theories imagine it could become. This realistic assessment led Schopenhauer to support constitutional monarchy as the form of government best suited to managing the inevitable conflicts of political life. He believed that concentrating final authority in a single individual who stood above factional competition could provide stability and impartial judgment that democratic systems often lacked. However, this monarchical authority needed to be limited by constitutional provisions that protected individual rights and prevented the abuse of power. The ideal system would combine the efficiency and impartiality of monarchical decision-making with the protection of liberty that constitutional limits could provide. Democratic systems, in Schopenhauer's view, tended to degenerate into factional conflict, where different groups struggled to use political power for their own advantage rather than for the common good. The majority rule principle could easily become a mechanism for oppressing minorities, while the competitive nature of democratic politics encouraged demagogy and short-term thinking rather than wise and principled governance. Schopenhauer was particularly critical of the optimistic assumptions that underlay much liberal and democratic political theory. Enlightenment thinkers had argued that education, rational discussion and democratic participation would gradually lead to better political decisions and more just social arrangements. But Schopenhauer doubted that most people possessed either the intellectual capacity or the moral motivation necessary for such rational political engagement. The majority of citizens were too focused on their immediate personal concerns to develop informed opinions about complex political questions. Even when they did form political opinions, these were usually based more on emotion, prejudice and self-interest than on careful analysis of evidence and principles. Democratic politics therefore tended to reward politicians who could manipulate popular emotions rather than those who offered wise and principled leadership. The result was often government by the lowest common denominator rather than government by the most capable and enlightened citizens. This analysis led Schopenhauer to prefer systems that concentrated authority in educated elites rather than distributing it among the masses. However, Schopenhauer's political conservatism was balanced by his humanitarian concern for reducing suffering and protecting the vulnerable. While he doubted that political action could create a just and harmonious society, he believed that government had important responsibilities for preventing unnecessary cruelty and maintaining basic conditions for human flourishing. He strongly supported legal protections for individual liberty, including freedom of thought, expression and religion. He advocated for humane treatment of criminals, arguing that punishment should focus on deterrence and rehabilitation rather than revenge. He was particularly concerned about the treatment of animals and believed that laws should protect them from unnecessary cruelty and exploitation. His compassionate ethics led him to support social policies that would reduce suffering even when he doubted the ultimate effectiveness of political solutions to human problems. Schopenhauer's analysis of economic questions reflected his broader skepticism about material progress as a solution to human suffering. He recognized that extreme poverty created unnecessary hardship and that society had obligations to provide basic necessities for all its members. However, he doubted that increasing general prosperity would significantly reduce human misery because new wealth typically generated new desires and forms of competition rather than lasting satisfaction. Wealthy societies might eliminate some forms of suffering related to material deprivation, but they often developed new sources of anxiety, status competition, and existential emptiness. The will's capacity for generating dissatisfaction was not limited by external circumstances. It could find ways to create suffering regardless of how favourable material conditions became. This insight led him to support moderate economic reforms that could reduce extreme hardship, while remaining sceptical about promises that economic progress would create a fundamentally better human condition. He was particularly critical of socialist theories that promised to eliminate inequality and create perfect justice through revolutionary transformation of economic relationships. While he sympathized with concerns about exploitation and unfair distribution of resources, he doubted that changing economic systems could eliminate the competitive dynamics that arise from the nature of willing itself. Socialist societies might redistribute wealth more equally, but they would still face conflicts between individual desires and collective needs. The same human drives that created problems under capitalism would find new ways to express themselves under socialism. Moreover, the concentration of economic power in government hands that socialism required could easily lead to political tyranny and the suppression of individual liberty. Schopenhauer preferred market systems with appropriate regulations and safety nets to revolutionary schemes that promised perfect equality at the cost of freedom and efficiency. Schopenhauer's views on nationalism and international relations reflected his understanding that group identification often intensified rather than reduced the conflicts generated by individual willing. When people identified strongly with their nation, ethnic group or religion, they could justify treating outsiders with cruelty and indifference that they would never accept toward members of their own group. Nationalism allowed individuals to feel virtuous about pursuing their group's interests at the expense of other groups, transforming selfishness into apparent patriotism or religious duty. Wars and international conflicts typically arose from these collective expressions of the will's competitive nature, rather than from rational disagreements that could be resolved through negotiation. While Schopenhauer believed that some form of group loyalty was probably inevitable, given human psychology, he advocated for international law and diplomacy as means for limiting the destructive effects of nationalist competition. He supported the development of international institutions that could mediate conflicts and establish basic standards for civilized behavior among nations. Despite his generally pessimistic assessment of political possibilities, Schopenhauer believed that philosophical insight and spiritual development could gradually improve political life by reducing the intensity of competitive willing among at least some individuals. People who achieved greater understanding of the illusory nature of individual separation might become more capable of genuine concern for others and less driven by narrow self-interest. Those who experienced the peace that comes from aesthetic contemplation or ethical insight might be less likely to support policies based on hatred, revenge, or exploitation. While such transformation would always remain rare, it could provide leaven for gradual improvement in the quality of political leadership and public discourse. Education that promoted self-knowledge and contemplative wisdom could contribute more to political progress than education focused purely on technical skills or ideological indoctrination. The ultimate solution to political problems lay not in better institutions, but in the kind of consciousness transformation that made individuals less prone to the competitive willing that created political conflicts in the first place. Part 15. Influence and Legacy. The influence of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy extended far beyond academic circles to transform literature, music, psychology, and popular culture throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Despite being largely ignored during his early career, his ideas eventually reached some of the most creative and influential minds of the modern era. Writers, artists, composers and thinkers found in his philosophy a sophisticated framework for understanding the darker aspects of human experience that optimistic Enlightenment thought had largely ignored. His unflinching analysis of suffering, his insights into the unconscious drives that motivate human behavior, and his vision of transcendence through art and contemplation provided intellectual tools for grappling with the complexities of modern life. The scope and depth of his influence demonstrate the enduring relevance of his central insights, even as subsequent thinkers modified, criticized, or built upon his specific formulations. Understanding this influence helps illuminate both the historical significance of Schopenhauer's work and its continued importance for contemporary discussions of consciousness, meaning, and human flourishing. Friedrich Nietzsche stands as perhaps the most important philosophical heir to Schopenhauer, though their relationship was complex and ultimately involved fundamental disagreement about the value and meaning of existence. As a young man, Nietzsche encountered Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation and described it as the most important intellectual experience of his life. He was deeply influenced by Schopenhauer's insight that reality consists fundamentally of blind, irrational striving rather than rational order or divine purpose. Nietzsche adopted and developed Schopenhauer's understanding that conscious thought is only the surface of a much deeper unconscious reality that drives human behavior. He also embraced Schopenhauer's critique of conventional morality as often serving interests other than those it explicitly claims to promote. However, Nietzsche ultimately rejected Schopenhauer's pessimistic conclusions about the value of existence and his recommendation that we should seek to escape the will through denial and asceticism. Instead, Nietzsche argued that we should embrace and affirm the will to power that he saw as the fundamental drive underlying all existence. Where Schopenhauer saw the will as a source of inevitable suffering that we should seek to transcend, Nietzsche saw it as the creative force that makes possible all achievement, beauty and meaning. He developed concepts like the overman and eternal recurrence as ways of celebrating rather than escaping the fundamental nature of existence. Nietzsche's philosophy can be understood as an ongoing dialogue with Schopenhauer, accepting many of his insights about human nature while drawing radically different conclusions about how we should respond to these insights. This creative engagement with Schopenhauer's ideas helped establish some of the most important themes in existential and postmodern philosophy. Even philosophers who disagreed with both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche found themselves addressing questions that their debate had made central to modern thought. Sigmund Freud acknowledged Schopenhauer as an important precursor to psychoanalysis, particularly for his insights into the unconscious sources of human motivation. Schopenhauer's analysis of how sexual desire operates beneath the surface of consciousness to influence behavior and decision-making anticipated many of Freud's discoveries about the role of repressed sexuality in psychological development. His understanding that conscious rational thought is often a rationalization of deeper unconscious drives provided a framework that Freud would develop into his theory of ego, ID, and superego. Schopenhauer's insight that individual identity is largely illusory, and that consciousness can transcend ordinary ego boundaries, influenced Freud's understanding of how psychoanalysis could transform the patient's relationship to their own unconscious motivations. However, where Schopenhauer saw the unconscious will as something to be ultimately transcended, Freud focused on achieving a better integration between conscious and unconscious processes. This difference reflects broader disagreements about the possibilities for human happiness and the proper goals of therapeutic intervention. The influence of Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory can be seen throughout modern literature and the arts. Writers like Thomas Mann, Marcel Proust, and Jorge Luis Borges found in his philosophy a sophisticated understanding of how art can provide temporary escape from the suffering of ordinary consciousness. His insight that great art reveals eternal patterns beneath the flux of particular events influenced literary techniques that sought to capture universal aspects of human experience through detailed attention to specific situations and characters. The idea that aesthetic contemplation involves a temporary dissolution of ego boundaries became important for understanding how readers and viewers can be transformed by encounters with genuine artistic achievement. His analysis of music as the most direct artistic expression of the will itself influenced composers and music theorists who sought to understand how instrumental music could convey profound emotional and philosophical content without relying on words or images. Richard Wagner, in particular, developed his concept of total artwork, partly based on Schopenhauer's understanding of music's unique capacity to express the deepest levels of reality. Schopenhauer's early engagement with Buddhist and Hindu philosophy helped establish the serious Western study of Eastern thought that became increasingly important throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. He was among the first major European philosophers to recognize that Indian philosophical traditions contained sophisticated insights that could enrich Western intellectual life. His synthesis of Kantian idealism with Eastern concepts like Maya and Nirvana provided a model for how Eastern and Western approaches to ultimate questions could be mutually illuminating. This influence extended beyond academic philosophy to affect popular interest in meditation, mindfulness, and contemplative practices that have become widespread in contemporary culture. Many people who practice yoga, meditation, or other forms of spiritual development have been indirectly influenced by the opening toward Eastern wisdom that Schopenhauer helped initiate. His demonstration that it was possible to appreciate Eastern insights while maintaining commitment to rational inquiry established a pattern that continues to influence contemporary discussions of spirituality and philosophy. The psychological and therapeutic applications of Schopenhauer's insights have extended far beyond their direct influence on Freud. His understanding that much suffering arises from attachment to desires that cannot be permanently satisfied has influenced various forms of therapy that focus on acceptance rather than gratification of problematic wants and needs. Cognitive behavioral therapy's emphasis on changing dysfunctional thought patterns rather than just satisfying desires reflects insights that Schopenhauer articulated philosophically. Mindfulness-based therapeutic approaches that teach patients to observe their thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them show clear connections to his understanding of how consciousness can transcend ordinary willing. His analysis of compassion as arising naturally from the recognition of fundamental interconnectedness has influenced therapeutic approaches that emphasize empathy, self-compassion, and the dissolution of artificial barriers between self and other. Even therapists who have never read Schopenhauer often work with concepts and techniques that reflect his insights about the nature of suffering and the possibilities for transcending it. Contemporary discussions of consciousness, meaning, and well-being continue to grapple with questions that Schopenhauer raised and analyzed with remarkable depth and sophistication. His insight that consciousness is more fundamental than the material processes that correlate with it remains relevant for current debates about the mind-body problem and the nature of subjective experience. His analysis of why material prosperity often fails to produce lasting happiness speaks directly to contemporary concerns about depression, anxiety, and existential emptiness in affluent societies. His understanding of how competitive individualism creates suffering that cannot be solved through better external arrangements remains important for discussions of social policy and political reform. His vision of transcendence through aesthetic experience, ethical insight and contemplative practice offers alternatives to both shallow materialism and dogmatic religiosity that many contemporary people find appealing. His demonstration that philosophical analysis and spiritual development can be mutually supportive rather than contradictory provides a model for approaching ultimate questions that honours both intellectual rigour and contemplative wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, Schopenhauer's unflinching honesty about the reality of suffering and his systematic search for genuine solutions to existential problems continue to inspire those who refuse to accept easy answers or false consolations. In an age that often promotes superficial optimism and consumer-based approaches to happiness, his insistence that we must understand suffering deeply before we can hope to transcend it remains both challenging and valuable. His demonstration that the highest human possibilities require moving beyond ego-based consciousness toward universal compassion and wisdom provides a vision of human development that remains as relevant today as it was in his own time. While few people may achieve the complete denial of the will that he considered the ultimate goal, his analysis of partial steps toward this ideal continues to offer practical guidance for anyone seeking deeper understanding and genuine peace. The scope and persistence of his influence testify to the enduring power of philosophical thinking that combines intellectual rigour with existential urgency, rational analysis with contemplative insight, and unflinching realism with genuine compassion. Arthur Schopenhauer created a philosophical legacy that continues to illuminate the deepest questions of human existence while providing practical wisdom for navigating the challenges of conscious life.